The chain rattled against the auction post, and Reed Holston felt something crack inside his chest, something he thought the war had already broken. 10 years he'd lived alone, speaking only to ghosts and dust. 10 years since he'd cared about anything but surviving one more hollow day. But when he saw her proud, bleeding, unbroken, standing in that crowd of jeering men, he knew his silence was over. One woman, one choice, one last chance to remember what it meant to be human. Stay with me until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The Arizona sun didn't forgive. It hammered down on the Redstone territory like God's own anvil, beating the color out of everything it touched: the sage, the stone, the broken men who tried to farm it. Reed Holston had learned not to expect mercy from the land, from the sky, or from memory. Mercy was a word that belonged to another life, one he'd buried alongside his wife 10 years ago. He stood now at the edge of his property, one boot on the fence rail, watching the dust devils spin themselves to death across the empty fields. His hands, scarred, calloused, permanently stained with the red Arizona clay, gripped the weathered wood like it was the only solid thing left in a world that kept trying to dissolve beneath him. The ranch wasn't much. 30 acres of stubborn earth, a cabin that leaked when it rained, a barn held together more by habit than nails, and a cemetery plot behind the kitchen window where Sarah Holston rested under a marker Reed had carved himself. Some mornings he forgot she was gone. Most mornings he wished he could. He'd been a different man once, a Union scout during the war, quick with a rifle and quicker with hope. He'd believed in causes back then, in the romance of justice, and the promise that good men could build something lasting if they just worked hard enough. The war had beaten that out of him slowly, with each body he'd stepped over, with each town burned to ash in the name of freedom. But Sarah had given it back to him piece by fragile piece. She'd made him believe again. Then cholera took her in 3 days. Reed hadn't believed in much since. "Water's low again," he muttered to himself, the sound of his own voice strange in the morning quiet. He talked to himself now more than he cared to admit, not out of madness, but out of necessity. The silence had weight out here, a pressure that could crush a man if he wasn't careful. Words, even his own, kept him tethered to something resembling sanity. He pushed off the fence and walked toward the well, his shadow stretching long and thin across the cracked earth. The sun was barely up, but already the heat was building, that peculiar Arizona heat that didn't just warm you, it hollowed you out, turned your bones to kindling and your thoughts to smoke. The ranch demanded everything and gave back nothing. But it was his, and it was all he had, and some days that was enough to keep him moving through the motions of living. By mid-morning, Reed had mucked the stalls, fed what few chickens still bothered to lay eggs in this heat, and replaced 3 boards on the barn door that had finally surrendered to rot. His shirt was soaked through, sticking to his back like a second skin, and his hands ached in that deep, bone-tired way that meant he'd probably overdone it again. He needed supplies. The thought sat heavy in his gut. Going into town meant people, and people meant questions, concerned looks. The weight of pity he could feel pressing against him like hands on his chest. The widow Thompson asking if he was eating enough. The preacher suggesting he attend Sunday services as if God was waiting in that whitewashed building with answers to questions Reed had stopped asking. The hardware store owner speaking too loud, too cheerful, like volume could fill the empty spaces. But he was out of coffee, low on nails, and the flour sack had developed a hole that left a pale trail across the kitchen floor like evidence of slow surrender. "Town it is," he said to the empty cabin, and began the ritual of making himself presentable. A clean shirt, his better hat, boots that weren't actively falling apart. He caught sight of himself in the small mirror by the door and barely recognized the man staring back. 42 years old, and he looked 60. The sun had carved lines deep into his face, and his eyes, once the bright blue Sarah had loved, had faded to something closer to winter ice. He saddled Copper, his aging roan gelding, and together they started the long ride into Redstone Crossing. The town had grown since he'd last bothered to visit maybe 2 months back, though time moved differently for Reed, stretching and compressing in ways he'd stopped trying to understand. New buildings had sprouted along Main Street, including a hotel that actually looked like it might have real beds instead of bug-infested straw pallets. The train had brought prosperity to Redstone, along with the kind of people who believed prosperity was a virtue in itself. Reed tied Copper outside the general store and stepped onto the boardwalk, immediately aware of how he stood out. The other men were clean-pressed, moving with the confident purpose of people who believed tomorrow would be better than today. Reed moved like a ghost, insubstantial and gray, trying not to draw attention as he pushed through the door. The store smelled of leather tobacco and the bitter tannins of strong tea. Reed gathered his supplies mechanically. Coffee nails, flour, a new file for the tools that were wearing down to uselessness. He was counting out coins at the counter when he heard the commotion outside. Raised voices, laughter with sharp edges, the particular sound of cruelty dressed up as entertainment. "Auction day," the store owner said, not looking up from Reed's pile of coins. "They got themselves a real curiosity out there today." Reed's hand stilled. "What kind of curiosity?" The man grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Last Apache woman in 3 territories, they're saying. Found her hiding in the mountains half dead from exposure. Sheriff Braddock's selling her off to cover his costs. Hell of a thing to see." Something cold moved through Reed's chest. Not quite anger, not quite horror, but something that lived in the space between them. He left his supplies on the counter and walked back outside into the brutal sunlight. A crowd had gathered in the livery yard across the street. Reed could hear the auctioneer's voice carrying over the general noise that practiced sing-song cadence that could make selling a human being sound like selling cattle or farm equipment. He shouldn't have crossed the street. He should have collected his supplies, mounted copper, and ridden back to the safety of his isolation where other people's suffering couldn't touch him. He crossed the street anyway. The crowd was maybe 30 strong, mostly men, mostly the kind who saw entertainment in degradation. Reed pushed through them not roughly, but with the solid inevitability of stone moving downhill until he could see what they'd come to witness. She stood chained to a post in the center of the yard, and Reed's breath caught in his throat. They called her the last Apache woman, but she looked like she'd been carved from the same red stone as the mountains themselves, weathered, unbreakable, ancient in a way that had nothing to do with age. She couldn't have been more than 25, but her eyes held centuries. Dark eyes that refused to drop, refused to show fear or shame or any of the things these men wanted to see. She'd been beaten. Reed could see the marks on her face the way she favored her left side, the blood dried at the corner of her mouth. Her clothes were torn, her hair tangled with dust and what might have been pine needles. But she stood straight, shoulders back, chin up, as if the chain around her wrists was a choice rather than a constraint. "Last of her kind," the auctioneer was shouting. "Found hiding in the northern canyons, strong, healthy, already broken in. Start the bidding at $20. Reed felt his hands curl into fists. The war had taught him violence, and for a moment he could feel it singing in his blood again, that old familiar rage that had once made him dangerous. 25? Someone shouted. 30? Called another. The woman's eyes swept across the crowd with something like contempt. Not fear contempt, as if they were the ones in chains, the ones reduced to animals, while she remained entirely impossibly free despite everything they'd done to her. 35. Reed watched her chest rise and fall with careful, controlled breaths. Watched the way she held herself like a weapon that hadn't decided whether to strike. There was a strength in her that the chain couldn't touch, that beating and starvation and captivity couldn't reach. $40. A rancher Reed vaguely recognized was laughing as he bid, nudging his companion. "Hell, I'll work that Apache pride right out of her." The crowd laughed. The woman didn't even look at them. And Reed, who'd sworn never to care again, who'd built his whole life around the careful maintenance of nothing, felt something crack open inside his chest. Something he'd thought was dead buried alongside Sarah under that hand-carved marker. His hand went to his pocket, to the leather pouch where he kept what little money he'd managed to save. It wasn't much. Last year's harvest had been poor and the cattle market had been worse. The money in his pocket represented 6 months of careful denial, of going without, of making do with broken things, because new things cost too much. 40 going once, the auctioneer called. Reed thought about the supplies still sitting on the counter inside the general store. Thought about the leaking roof and the worn-through boots and all the small necessities he'd been putting off because there was never quite enough money to go around. 40 going twice? The woman's eyes found his across the crowd, and for just a moment something passed between them. Not recognition, but a kind of acknowledgement. as if she could see straight through his weathered exterior into the ruins of who he used to be. "Sold for $50, Reed heard himself say. The crowd turned to look at him, and Reed felt the weight of their attention like physical pressure. He knew most of these men by sight, if not by name, knew their casual cruelties, their easy assumptions, the way they'd turned suffering into sport. The auctioneer squinted at him. "That you, Holston, didn't know you were in the market for $50. Reed repeated, his voice flat and hard. "Take it or don't." There was a pause, a moment of calculation where the auctioneer seemed to consider whether there might be more money to squeeze from this situation. But Reed's reputation, such as it was, preceded him. The crazy hermit farmer who'd lived alone for a decade and talked to ghosts wasn't someone you push too hard. "Sold." The auctioneer brought down his hand with theatrical finality. "To Reed Holston for $50. Reed pushed through the crowd toward the woman, pulling out his money as he went. His hands were shaking from anger or fear or something else he couldn't name. When he reached the post, he handed over the bills to Sheriff Braddock, who'd been standing nearby watching the whole proceeding with the bored expression of a man who'd seen too much and felt too little. "Need you to sign for her," Braddock said, producing a paper from his vest pocket. "She's your property now, legal and binding. Any trouble she causes, any laws she breaks, it's on you." Property. The word sat like poison in Reed's mouth. He signed the paper because he didn't know what else to do, because walking away now would mean leaving her to whoever bid next. Braddock unlocked the chain from the post, but left it around her wrists. "She's wild," he said conversationally. "Wouldn't talk, wouldn't cooperate. Found her near dead in a cave 3 weeks back. Been hell trying to figure out what to do with her." Reed took the chain from Braddock's hand, and the weight of it, both physical and symbolic, nearly dropped him to his knees. He looked at the woman, at her dark, unreadable eyes, and had no idea what to say, how to explain what he'd just done. "Can you ride?" he finally asked. She didn't answer, just looked at him with that same expression of controlled contempt, as if his question was beneath her notice. Reed turned and started walking toward where Copper was tied, expecting her to resist, to fight, to make this harder than it already was. But she followed, the chain clinking softly between them, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth of the street. The crowd was already dispersing, moving on to the next entertainment, the next diversion. Reed heard fragments of conversation as he passed. "Holston's finally lost it. Give him a week before he brings her back. Apache witch gonna curse his land." But he kept walking, kept his eyes forward, kept moving, because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean questioning, and he couldn't afford questions right now. He untied Copper and turned to face the woman. Up close, he could see more details, the silver that had been worked into her torn shirt, the careful beadwork that spoke of better days, the white scars on her arms that looked like they'd been there long before this captivity. She was taller than he'd realized, nearly his own height, with the lean strength of someone who'd spent their life moving through difficult terrain. "I'm going to help you up," Reed said quietly. "I'm not going to hurt you." Still no response. But when he moved to assist her, she didn't flinch away. She let him lift her onto Copper's back, though the way she sat rigid, balanced, ready to bolt, made it clear she was granting permission rather than surrendering to necessity. Reed swung up behind her, acutely aware of how close they were, of how she tensed when his arms came around her to take the reins. He could smell smoke in her hair and pine, and something else, something wild that spoke of mountain air and freedom. "I need to get my supplies," he said, not sure why he was explaining himself. "Then we'll head to my ranch. It's about an hour's ride." She said nothing. Reed guided Copper back to the general store, left the woman mounted while he collected his purchases from the counter. The store owner looked at him with naked curiosity, but had the good sense not to ask questions. Reed loaded his supplies into his saddlebags and climbed back up behind the woman. They rode out of Redstone Crossing in silence, and Reed felt the town's judgment following them like shadows growing long in the afternoon sun. The ride back was the longest hour of Reed's life. He was hyper-aware of every shift in the woman's posture, every sharp breath, every moment of tension. She sat in front of him like a drawn bow, all coiled energy and barely contained violence. Reed half expected her to try something, grab the reins, throw herself from the horse, anything to escape this new form of captivity. But she did nothing. just sat and breathed and stared at the horizon like she was reading messages written in the dust. Reed tried to think about what he'd say when they reached the ranch, how he'd explain what he'd done and why, but words felt inadequate, like trying to dam a river with wishes. So he said nothing, and the silence between them grew thick with things neither could express. The sun was starting its descent when the ranch finally came into view. The sagging barn, the listing cabin, the small plot of turned earth where Sarah's marker stood like an accusation. Reed felt a strange shame wash over him seeing his home through a stranger's eyes. It looked like what it was, the dwelling place of a man who'd given up on everything except not dying. He dismounted first, then reached up to help the woman down. She ignored his offered hand and slid from Copper's back with a grace that spoke of countless hours on horseback. The chain still bound her wrists, and Reed realized with sudden horror that he had no key, no way to remove the physical symbol of her captivity. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared into the barn. He emerged moments later with a file and a hacksaw, tools he normally used for mending fence wire. "I'm going to cut the chain. I need you to hold still." For the first time, something flickered across her face, surprise maybe, or suspicion. She extended her wrist slowly, watching him with those dark, unreadable eyes. Reed worked carefully, filing through the links with steady, patient strokes. It took nearly 20 minutes, and by the end, his shoulders were screaming and sweat was pouring down his face. But finally the chain parted and fell away, leaving angry red welts around her wrists, where the metal had bitten deep. The woman brought her hands to her chest, rubbing the damaged skin, and Reed saw her shoulders drop just slightly, the first sign of relief she'd shown since he'd laid eyes on her. "You can go," Reed said quietly. "Right now if you want. I won't stop you. I won't come after you. You're free." She looked at him for a long moment, and Reed couldn't begin to guess what she was thinking. Then she looked past him at the darkening sky, at the mountains rising purple in the distance, at the empty land stretching away in every direction. When she looked back at him, there was a question in her eyes, though she still didn't speak. "Or," Reed continued the words, feeling their way forward uncertainly. "You can stay, at least for tonight. There's a spare room in the cabin. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. There's food, water. You can rest, gather your strength, and decide what you want to do in the morning." Still no answer. But she didn't leave either. Reed turned and walked toward the cabin, not looking back to see if she'd follow. He heard her footsteps behind him after a moment, soft, cautious, the steps of someone who'd learned not to trust easy offers. Inside the cabin was exactly as he'd left it. Sparse, functional, clean, in the way of places where no one lives, only exists. Reed lit the lamps against the gathering darkness and gestured toward the small table that served as his dining room, his desk, and his thinking spot all at once. "Sit," he said. "I'll make food." The woman remained standing near the door, one hand resting lightly on the frame, her body positioned for rapid exit. Reed understood. He would have done the same. He busied himself with making dinner beans, cornbread, some salt pork that had been hanging in the larder. Simple food, the kind he'd been eating alone for 10 years. While he cooked, he was aware of her eyes on him, watching his every move with the intensity of someone cataloging potential threats. When the food was ready, Reed set 2 plates on the table and sat down at one. He began eating without ceremony, without pressure, just showing her that the food was safe and she was welcome to it if she chose. After several long minutes, she crossed the room and sat at the other place. She ate slowly, methodically, with her eyes on him the entire time. Reed tried not to stare, tried to give her the privacy of not being observed, but he found himself glancing at her between bites. In the lamplight, her face held a kind of austere beauty. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes that seemed to hold entire histories. The bruises on her face stood out more starkly now, and Reed felt anger rising again at the casual brutality that had put them there. "My name is Reed," he said when the meal was finished. "Reed Holston. This is my ranch. It's not much, but it's mine, and while you're here, it's yours too." She didn't respond, but something in her posture shifted, not quite relaxation, but a slight easing of the constant tension. Reed stood and cleared the plates, then opened the door to the spare room. The room that had once been meant for children he and Sarah never had. It held a bed, a washstand, and nothing else. He'd kept it clean over the years, out of habit, more than hope. "This is yours," he said. "There's a bolt on the inside of the door. Use it. I won't come in. I won't bother you. In the morning, you can decide what you want to do." The woman moved past him into the room, and for just a moment their eyes met. Reed saw in them something he recognized, the particular exhaustion that came from losing everything and still being forced to keep walking. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "I promise you that." She closed the door without speaking, and Reed heard the bolt slide home with a solid click. He stood in the main room for a long time, staring at the closed door, wondering what the hell he'd just done. He'd bought a woman, brought her to his home, given her his word that she was safe and free, in the same breath as if those things could coexist in a world that had shown them both nothing but contradiction. Outside, the desert night was settling in, bringing with it the cold that always followed the brutal heat. Reed sat at his table in the lamplight and tried to make sense of the day, of the choice he'd made, of the strange woman sleeping or not sleeping in the room that had been empty for 10 years. He thought about Sarah, about what she would have said if she could see him now. She'd always had more faith in his capacity for good than he'd ever had himself. "You've got a kind heart under all that armor," she used to say. "One day you're going to remember how to use it." Reed looked at the closed door again and wondered if maybe impossibly she'd been right. The night stretched on, and Reed eventually made his way to his own bed, but sleep came hard and thin, broken by the awareness that he was no longer alone in the world, that another person was breathing the air of his home, that tomorrow would bring questions he had no idea how to answer. Somewhere in the darkest hours before dawn, Reed woke to the sound of movement in the main room. He rose quietly and peered through his doorway to see her standing at his window, looking out at the darkness with an expression of such profound loss that it made his chest ache. She didn't know he was watching. She stood there for a long time, one hand pressed against the glass, and Reed understood that she was saying goodbye to something, to someone, to a life that had been taken from her piece by piece until nothing remained but this strange, awful present. Reed slipped back into his bed and lay awake until sunrise, listening to her quiet movements, thinking about chains, the ones made of metal, the ones made of memory, and the ones we forge ourselves from all the ways we've learned to stop hoping. When morning light finally came creeping through the windows, Reed rose and started the day's routine, not knowing if she'd still be there when he emerged from his room, not knowing if the bolt would still be thrown or if the door would be standing open to an empty space. He made coffee, the smell filling the cabin with something almost like welcome. And when he turned from the stove, she was standing in the doorway of her room, watching him with those dark, measuring eyes. She hadn't left. It was a beginning. Reed poured 2 cups of coffee, the steam rising between them like questions neither knew how to ask. He set 1 cup on the table and took his own to the window, giving her space, giving her choice. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of copper and gold, the same colors that lived in the earth beneath their feet. She moved to the table slowly, her movements still carrying that coiled wariness, and wrapped both hands around the cup, as if testing whether it was real or some kind of trick. Reed watched her from the corner of his eye, pretending to study the horizon while actually cataloging every detail, the way she held herself, the slight tremor in her fingers that spoke of exhaustion deeper than one night's sleep could touch, the way her eyes constantly tracked the exits. "I have work to do today," Reed said after the silence had stretched long enough to become comfortable. "Fences need mending on the south pasture, chickens need feeding. The barn door's about to fall off its hinges again." He paused, took a sip of coffee. "You can stay here in the cabin. Rest. There's food in the larder water in the basin, or—" He hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "Or you can come with me. Help if you want. I won't force you either way." She stared into her coffee cup like it might hold answers written in the dark liquid. Reed gave her silence, gave her time, and finished his own cup before setting it in the wash basin. "I'll be in the barn," he said, and walked out into the morning that was already promising to be scorching. Reed spent an hour mucking stalls and checking the horses, his hands working through familiar motions while his mind circled the same questions over and over. What was he supposed to do now? He'd saved her from one form of captivity, but what had he given her in return? A lonely ranch in the middle of nowhere owned by a man who barely spoke, who'd forgotten how to be human somewhere between the war and his wife's grave. He was replacing a broken hinge on the barn door when he heard footsteps behind him. Reed turned to find her standing in the doorway, the morning light silhouetting her form, making her look like something conjured from dust and determination. She'd washed her face, he could see that. The dried blood was gone, though the bruises remained, painting her skin in shades of purple and yellow. She'd tied her hair back with a strip of cloth she must have torn from something, and her eyes. Those dark, unreadable eyes were fixed on the tools in his hands. "There's another hammer in the toolbox," Reed said quietly, "and wire pliers if you know how to use them." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she crossed to the toolbox, selected the pliers, with the confidence of someone who'd held tools before, and looked at him expectantly. Reed almost smiled. Almost. "South fence," he said. "Follow me." They walked across the property in silence, Reed carrying the wire and posts, her carrying the tools. The sun climbed higher, turning the air thick and heavy, but she didn't complain. Didn't slow down, just matched his pace, like she'd been walking this land her whole life. The fence was in worse shape than Reed had realized. Entire sections had sagged or collapsed, creating gaps wide enough for what little livestock he had left to wander through. It would take days to fix it all, but Reed had learned to think in terms of small victories, one post at a time, one stretch of wire, one more day of keeping everything from falling completely apart. He drove the first post into the ground with steady blows of the hammer, feeling the impact sing up his arms. When he looked up, she was already working on the wire, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, twisting and securing with a skill that spoke of knowledge earned rather than taught. They worked through the morning, the sun beating down on them like judgment sweat, soaking through their clothes, until they were both marked by dark patches of effort. Reed found himself falling into a rhythm with her, an unspoken coordination that didn't require words. When he needed wire, she was already handing it to him. When she needed a post braced, he was already moving to hold it steady. By noon, they'd repaired 3 sections of fence, and Reed's shoulders were screaming. He straightened, wiping sweat from his face with his sleeve, and gestured toward the shade of a nearby cottonwood. "Break," he said. "We need water." He'd brought a canteen, which he offered to her first. She took it, drank deeply, and handed it back without meeting his eyes. Reed drank his share and then settled against the tree trunk, closing his eyes against the relentless brightness. "You're good with your hands," he said after a while. "You've done this kind of work before." Silence answered him, but it was a different kind of silence now, not hostile, just careful. Reed tried again. "I know you can understand me. And I know you can speak even if you choose not to. That's fine. I'm not going to force words out of you." He opened his eyes and looked at her profile, at the strong line of her jaw, the way she held herself like a weapon even in rest. "But I want you to know I meant what I said last night. You're free here. Free to stay free, to go free to be silent or speak or anything in between. What I did yesterday, buying you, I know how it looked. I know what those papers say. But I don't own you. Nobody owns you. Not anymore." She turned to look at him, then really look at him, and Reed felt the weight of that gaze like physical pressure. She was measuring him, he understood, calculating whether his words held truth or were just another form of trap. "My wife died 10 years ago." Reed heard himself saying words he hadn't spoken aloud to anyone since it happened. "Cholera. I couldn't save her. Couldn't do anything but watch her fade away over 3 days while I sat there feeling useless as tits on a bull." He laughed, but it came out bitter. "I swore after that I wouldn't get attached to anything again. Wouldn't care. Caring just meant more ways to hurt." He looked down at his scarred hands. "Yesterday when I saw you in that yard chained up like an animal while those bastards laughed and bid on you like you were property, something broke in me. Or maybe something finally unbroken. I couldn't walk away. I don't expect you to understand. Hell, I don't understand it myself." The silence that followed felt different, somehow softer, less defensive. "Awanada," she said finally, her voice rough from disuse, barely more than a whisper. Reed's head snapped up. "What? My name?" She was still looking away, but her hands had stopped. Their constant movement had settled into something like peace. Awanada. The name felt sacred on the air between them, like a gift given reluctantly but genuinely. Reed nodded slowly. "Awanada," he repeated, trying to honor it with proper pronunciation. "That's a good name. Strong. It means..." She paused, searching for words in a language that wasn't hers, but had been forced on her anyway. One who wanders, one who seeks. Seems fitting, Reed said quietly. They sat in silence for a while longer, and Reed felt something shift in the air between them. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the possibility of trust someday. We should get back to work, he said eventually. This fence won't fix itself much as I wish it would. Awanada stood, and for the first time something that might have been the shadow of a smile crossed her face. Your fence is shit, she said the words, heavily accented but clear. Reed laughed, actually laughed a sound so foreign it almost startled him. Yeah, he agreed. Yeah, it really is. They worked through the afternoon, and as the day wore on, Reed noticed small changes. Awanada's shoulders weren't quite so rigid. Her movements weren't quite so defensive. When their hands brushed accidentally while working on a particularly stubborn wire, she didn't flinch away. By the time the sun started its descent, they'd repaired nearly a quarter of the south fence. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Enough to feel like progress, enough to feel like maybe tomorrow they could do a little more. They walked back to the cabin together, both exhausted, both covered in dust and sweat. And Reed realized it was the first time in 10 years he'd finished a day's work with someone else beside him. The realization sat strange in his chest, somewhere between comfort and pain. I'll make dinner, Reed said when they reached the cabin. There's a wash basin in your room. Water in the pitcher. Awanada nodded and disappeared into her room, closing the door softly behind her. Reed heard water splashing, heard quiet movements, and went about preparing their meal. More beans, more cornbread, some dried apples he'd been saving for no particular reason. When she emerged, her face was clean and her hair was wet, hanging in dark waves past her shoulders. She'd changed into one of the spare shirts Reed had left in her room, one of his old ones too big on her frame but clean and whole. The sight of her in his clothing did something strange to Reed's heart, something he couldn't quite name. They ate together at the small table, and this time Awanada didn't watch him with quite so much suspicion. She ate steadily, methodically, like someone making up for missed meals. How long were you in those mountains? Reed asked quietly. Before they found you. Awanada's hand stilled on her fork. For a moment Reed thought she wouldn't answer, that he'd pushed too far, too fast. But then she spoke, her voice low and measured. 3 months, maybe 4. Time, she struggled for the word. Time becomes strange when you are alone. I know, Reed said. I know exactly what you mean. She looked at him then, and he saw recognition in her eyes, the recognition of one isolated soul seeing another. They killed my family, she said, suddenly the words coming out flat and hard. Soldiers, 2 years ago. My father, my brothers, my mother, everyone. She took a breath that rattled in her chest. I ran. I hid. I became good at disappearing. But this land... She gestured vaguely toward the windows, toward the vast emptiness beyond. This land has no more places to hide, no more shadows deep enough. Reed felt anger rising again, that old familiar rage at the casual cruelty of men with guns and authority. I'm sorry, he said, knowing the words were inadequate, but needing to say them anyway. I'm so goddamn sorry. Awanada shook her head. Sorry does not bring back the dead. Sorry does not unmake what was done. She looked directly at him. But you are different from the others. I do not know why. I do not know if I should trust this difference. You shouldn't, Reed said honestly. You should trust your instincts, your survival skills, all the things that kept you alive this long. Don't trust me just because I say pretty words and give you a room. He leaned forward, his eyes serious. But I'll earn it. However long it takes, I'll prove that my words match my actions. Something flickered across Awanada's face, surprise maybe, or the beginning of respect. She nodded slowly and returned to her meal. The days that followed fell into a pattern, a rhythm as steady as breathing. They woke with the sun, worked through the morning heat, rested during the worst of the afternoon, then worked again until dusk made it impossible to see. The fence slowly came together under their combined efforts. The barn door got fixed. The chicken coop got reinforced against coyotes. The cabin got small repairs that Reed had been putting off for years. And slowly, carefully, like winter ice melting into spring, Awanada began to speak. Not much at first, single words, brief answers to direct questions, but gradually more observations about the work, questions about the tools, occasional comments that held the dry edge of humor. Reed learned that she'd been married once before the soldiers came, that her husband had died trying to protect their village, that she'd been good with horses, had a gift for understanding them in ways that went beyond words, that she missed the mountains, missed the old ways, missed a life that had been stolen from her piece by piece until nothing remained but survival. And Reed, who'd spent 10 years speaking only to himself and ghosts, found himself talking too. About Sarah, about the war, about the farm they'd planned to build together, and how it had become a mausoleum instead. About the weight of living when everyone you loved was dead. About how some mornings he forgot why he bothered getting out of bed. "But you do," Awanada said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the sky in impossible colors. "Get out of bed, every day." "Yeah," Reed agreed. "I do." "Why?" Reed thought about it for a long time. "Because giving up would mean they won," he said finally. "The war, the disease, all the things that tried to break me. If I quit, if I lay down and let the dust take me, then all that suffering was for nothing." He looked at her. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," Awanada said softly. "That makes sense." 3 weeks passed and Reed realized he was no longer tracking the days with the same desperate monotony. Time had begun to mean something again, not just empty hours to survive, but moments to experience. The morning ritual of coffee shared in companionable silence, the satisfaction of completing a task together. The evening conversations that grew longer and deeper as trust slowly, carefully built itself between them. He caught himself smiling sometimes, a sensation so foreign it felt like someone else's face. Caught himself looking forward to tomorrow instead of dreading it. Caught himself aware of her presence in ways that had nothing to do with pity or obligation and everything to do with simple human connection. One morning, Reed found Awanada in the barn, talking to the horses in her own language, soft musical words that made Copper's ears prick forward with interest. She had her hand on the old gelding's neck. Her eyes closed, and there was a peace in her expression that Reed had never seen before. "He likes you," Reed said from the doorway. Awanada didn't startle, had probably heard him coming long before he spoke. "He is lonely," she said, "like his owner." "Was lonely," Reed corrected gently. "Past tense." She turned to look at him, and the smile that crossed her face was small but genuine. "Yes," she agreed, "was." That afternoon, while they were working on reinforcing the corral, Awanada spoke without prompting. "When I was young, before everything changed, my grandmother taught me about plants, medicine plants, how to find them, how to prepare them, how to use them for healing." Reed paused in his hammering. "Yeah. I see some growing here, at the edges of your property. Wild tobacco, yarrow, sage." She gestured toward the scrubland beyond the fences. "If you wanted, I could gather them, make medicines. For wounds, for sickness, for pain." "I'd like that," Reed said. "I'd like that a lot." The next morning he found a collection of dried plants hanging from the rafters in the kitchen, arranged with careful precision. The cabin smelled different, cleaner, somehow infused with sage and something else he couldn't identify. Awanada was at the stove making breakfast, moving through his space with growing confidence, and Reed realized with a start that this wasn't his space anymore. It was theirs. "Coffee?" she asked, looking over her shoulder. "Please," Reed said, and sat at the table that no longer felt like a place of isolation, but like the center of something that might eventually become home again. They were finishing breakfast when Reed noticed Awanada staring at her hands at the calluses forming at the dirt permanently embedded under her nails despite washing. "I am becoming like you," she said, and he couldn't tell if it was a complaint or an observation. "How so?" "Work-worn, earth-stained." She flexed her fingers. "My mother would not recognize these hands." Reed looked at his own hands, scarred, weathered, marked by years of labor. "No," he agreed. "But they're honest hands, strong hands, hands that build things instead of destroying them. He met her eyes. That's not nothing. Awanada considered this, then nodded slowly. No, she echoed. Not nothing. That evening, Reed made a decision. He went to the small trunk at the foot of his bed, the one he hadn't opened in 10 years, and pulled out clothes that had belonged to Sarah, practical work clothes dresses she'd worn while gardening, or cooking boots that had been good quality once. He carried them to Awanada's room and knocked softly on the door. She opened it, curiosity and wariness mixing in her expression. These were my wife's, Reed said, holding out the bundle. She was about your size. They're just sitting in a trunk collecting dust and sadness. She'd want them used. He struggled for words. She'd want you to have them, if you want them. Awanada took the bundle carefully, her fingers running over the fabric. You are certain? I'm certain, Reed said. Sarah believed things should be used, not mourned. She'd be happy knowing they were helping someone. The next morning, Awanada emerged wearing one of Sarah's work dresses, simple brown cotton with a collar. Reed remembered kissing once, on a morning that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. The dress fit her differently than it had fit Sarah. But seeing it worn again, seeing life breathed back into fabric that had been dormant for a decade, did something to Reed's heart that hurt and healed in equal measure. It fits good, Reed managed. Thank you, Awanada said quietly, for trusting me with her memory. The gesture changed something between them. Awanada moved through the cabin with less hesitation, now rearranged things to make them more efficient, added small touches that made the space feel lived in rather than merely occupied. She hung herbs in the windows. She repaired the curtains that had been tattered for years. She brought wildflowers in from the fields and set them on the table in a chipped cup that suddenly looked beautiful. Reed watched these transformations with something like wonder. The cabin was coming back to life, and so he realized was he. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Awanada asked the question Reed had been waiting for. What happens when winter comes? Reed was quiet for a long time. What do you mean? I mean, she searched for words. Do I stay? Do I go? What is this arrangement we have made? That's up to you, Reed said carefully. I told you you're free, but if you're asking whether you're welcome to stay, then yes, for as long as you want. Through winter, through spring, through whatever comes after. He turned to look at her profile illuminated by starlight. I won't lie, I've gotten used to having you here, used to not being alone. But I won't keep you if you want to leave. Where would I go? Awanada asked softly. Everyone I knew is dead. My people are scattered, hunted, destroyed. This land, she gestured at the darkness. This land has no place for someone like me anymore. It has a place here, Reed said, on this ranch, with me, if that's what you want. Awanada was silent for so long Reed thought he'd made a mistake, pushed too hard, assumed too much. But then she said, I have been alone for so long, running, hiding, surviving, but not living. Here with you doing this work, she paused. Here I remember what it feels like to be human, to have purpose beyond not dying. I know the feeling, Reed said quietly. She turned to face him fully. But I need to know, what am I to you? Am I a worker? A guest? She struggled for the word. A friend, Reed said. That's what I'd like you to be. A friend. Someone I share this life with, such as it is. Awanada nodded slowly. Friends, she repeated, testing the word. Yes, I can be that. But Reed saw something flicker in her eyes. Something that suggested friendship might not be all she was considering, and he felt an answering flutter in his own chest, dangerous, complicated, and too fragile to name. The next day they rode into town together for supplies. It was the first time Awanada had left the ranch since Reed had brought her there, and he could feel her tension as they approached Redstone Crossing. The town was different now, in her eyes no longer just a place of commerce, but the site of her humiliation, her sale, her reduction to property. We can turn back, Reed offered. I can come another day. No, Awanada said firmly. I will not hide. I will not let them make me afraid. They rode down Main Street side by side, and Reed felt the weight of every stare, every whisper, every judgment passing like waves around them. The widow Thompson clutched her shopping bag a little tighter, the preacher's face pinched with disapproval. The men outside the saloon watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. Reed ignored them all, tied Copper outside the general store, and offered his hand to help Awanada down. She took it the first time she'd voluntarily accepted his touch, and stepped onto the boardwalk with her head high and her shoulders back, every inch of her radiating dignity that chains and beatings and sale couldn't diminish. Inside the store, the owner's eyes widened. "Holston! Didn't expect to see you back so soon." And with, he trailed off, uncertain what word to use. "With Awanada?" Reed supplied firmly. "We need supplies." He made his purchases while Awanada wandered the store, her fingers trailing over fabrics and tools and items she probably hadn't seen in years. Reed watched her pause at a display of ribbons, foolish, frivolous things, and saw longing cross her face before she turned away. At the counter, Reed added the ribbons to his purchases. "And those," he said. The owner wrapped everything carefully, took Reed's money, and said nothing. But his eyes followed Awanada with naked curiosity until Reed cleared his throat loudly. Outside, Reed handed Awanada the package with the ribbons. "For you," he said, "if you want them." She opened the package, saw the ribbons red and blue and gold, and her eyes went bright with something that might have been tears. "You did not have to—" "I know," Reed said, "but I wanted to." Awanada clutched the package to her chest, and when she looked at him, there was something new in her expression, something warm and grateful and complicated that made Reed's heart beat faster. They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was a different silence than before. Comfortable, companionable. The silence of two people who'd begun to understand each other beyond words. That night, Awanada wore one of the ribbons in her hair at dinner. It was a small thing, a simple thing, but it transformed her, brought color to her face, made her look less like a survivor and more like a woman who might someday remember how to thrive. "It looks good," Reed said. "Thank you," Awanada replied, "for seeing me, not as property or as Apache or as problem to solve, but as person." Reed felt his throat tighten. "That's all I've ever seen," he said quietly. The days grew shorter as autumn approached, bringing cooler nights and the promise of winter on the horizon. Reed and Awanada worked to prepare cutting firewood, reinforcing the cabin against cold, storing food for lean months ahead. They worked side by side now without awkwardness, their movements coordinated through practice and growing familiarity. One evening, Reed was chopping wood when he felt her watching him. He turned to find Awanada leaning against the cabin wall, her arms crossed, something thoughtful in her expression. "What?" he asked. "You are different from the men who destroyed my life," she said. "But you were soldier once. You have killed." It wasn't a question, but Reed answered anyway. "Yes, in the war. I killed because I was told to, because I believed in the cause, because it was them or my friends." He set down the axe. "I'm not proud of it, but I won't pretend it didn't happen." "Do you have nightmares?" "Sometimes," Reed admitted. "Less now than before. Less since." He paused. "Less since you've been here." Awanada nodded slowly. "I have nightmares too. Of the soldiers, of running, of watching everyone die while I hid like coward." Her voice dropped. "But they are quieter now, smaller, because I am not alone in the dark anymore." They stood in the gathering twilight, and Reed felt the space between them charged with things unspoken, with possibilities neither was quite ready to name. "We're a pair," Reed said finally. "Two broken people trying to fix each other by accident." "Maybe we are not broken," Awanada suggested. "Maybe we are just bent, and bent things can still be useful." Reed smiled. "I like that better." As the stars emerged above them, Reed realized that something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer farmer and rescued woman owner and property, or even just friends sharing a roof. They were becoming something else, two people learning to live again, learning to hope again, learning that maybe survival wasn't the same thing as living, and that choosing to try for more took more courage than either had known they possessed. But the world beyond the ranch didn't care about courage or hope, or two people trying to heal each other. And trouble, Reed knew from long experience, had a way of finding you even when you weren't looking for it. The trouble came on a Tuesday morning in the form of Sheriff Braddock riding up the dusty road with 3 men Reed didn't recognize. They wore badges that didn't look quite official and expressions that promised nothing good. Reed was in the barn when he heard the horses. He emerged into the sunlight, one hand instinctively going to the rifle he'd started keeping closer since bringing Awanada home. Behind him, he heard her soft footsteps, felt her presence at his back. "Holston," Braddock called, dismounting with the casual authority of a man who'd never been told no. "Need a word." "About what?" Reed asked, not moving from his position in the barn doorway. "About that Apache woman you bought." Braddock gestured toward where Awanada stood. "Got some questions about her legal status." Reed felt ice form in his chest. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that need answering in town. Official business." Braddock's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you understand." "No," Reed said flatly. "I don't understand. I bought her legally, got papers and everything. She's free now, living here of her own choice. There's no legal status to question." One of the other men, tall with a scar bisecting his cheek, spoke up. "We got reports she might be connected to some Apache troubles up north. Some raids, some stolen horses. Need to verify she's not one of the ones we're looking for." "That's bullshit and you know it," Reed said, his voice hard as stone. "She's been here over a month. Hasn't left the property except once to town with me. Whatever trouble you're talking about has nothing to do with her." "Still need to verify," Braddock said, and there was something oily in his tone that made Reed's skin crawl. "You can come along if you want. Make sure everything's handled proper." Reed felt Awanada's hand touch his back lightly, a warning or maybe a request. He glanced at her and saw controlled fury in her eyes, saw her calculating odds and escapes and outcomes. "She's not going anywhere," Reed said. "If you want to ask questions, ask them here. But she's not getting on a horse with you, and she's sure as hell not going back to whatever cage you've got planned." The tension ratcheted up instantly. The 3 men with Braddock shifted in their saddles' hands, moving toward weapons. Braddock's false friendliness evaporated. "Now, Holston, don't make this difficult. We got authority here." "You got shit," Reed interrupted. "You got a badge and some made-up excuse to harass a woman who's done nothing wrong. And it ends here on my property right now." For a long moment, everyone froze. Then Braddock smiled genuinely, this time, but with all the warmth of a snake. "Have it your way. But this isn't over. Sooner or later, we'll be back. And maybe next time we won't be so polite." They rode away, leaving dust and threat hanging in the air like smoke. Reed didn't lower the rifle until they were out of sight, and even then his hands were shaking with adrenaline and rage. "They will come back," Awanada said quietly. "I know," Reed said. "But not today. Today we won. And tomorrow—" Reed turned to face her, fully seeing the fear she was trying to hide, seeing the old wariness creeping back into her posture. "Tomorrow we'll be ready," he said. "Together." Awanada searched his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Together," she repeated, and Reed heard in that single word both question and promise, both fear and hope, both ending and beginning. The sun continued its arc across the Arizona sky, indifferent to human drama, and Reed and Awanada returned to their work. But something had changed. The bubble of safety they'd been building had been pierced, reminding them both that the world beyond the ranch was still dangerous, still hostile, still ready to take away whatever fragile peace they'd managed to construct. But they kept working anyway, kept building, kept choosing to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were strong enough together to face whatever came next. The confrontation with Braddock changed the rhythm of their days. Reed found himself watching the horizon more often, his rifle always within reach, his body tense with anticipation of threats that might materialize at any moment. Awanada moved through the ranch with renewed wariness, her old survival instincts resurging like muscle memory she couldn't quite shake. But something else changed too. The threat that had driven them apart momentarily now pulled them closer together, creating an intimacy born of shared danger and mutual protection. They stayed near each other more, worked within sight of one another, and at night Reed found himself listening for sounds from her room, making sure she was safe, making sure she was still there. 3 days after Braddock's visit, Reed woke to find Awanada already up, sitting at the kitchen table in the pre-dawn darkness, with a cup of coffee going cold between her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion that spoke of sleepless nights. "Bad dreams?" Reed asked quietly, lighting a lamp. "Always bad dreams," Awanada said. "But tonight was worse. I dreamed they came back, took me away, put me in chains again." Her hands trembled slightly. "And you could not stop them." Reed pulled out a chair and sat across from her the table, a small barrier between their shared fear. "I won't let that happen," he said. "You cannot promise that. You are one man. They are many with law on their side, with guns and authority, and the belief that I am nothing." Her voice cracked slightly. "I have been running so long, Reed. I am tired of running, but I do not know how to stop." Reed reached across the table slowly enough that she could pull away if she wanted, and covered her trembling hands with his own. They were both scarred, both marked by labor and loss, but together they felt steadier somehow. "Then we don't run," he said firmly. "We stand. Right here on this land, and we make them understand that you belong here. Not as property, not as something I own, but as someone who has every right to exist freely in this world." Awanada looked down at their joined hands, and something shifted in her expression. "Why do you care so much? You could have walked away in town that day. Could have let me be someone else's problem. Could have—" "I couldn't," Reed interrupted. "I tried to walk away, stood there in that crowd telling myself it wasn't my business, wasn't my fight. But then I looked at you, saw the way you refused to break even with chains on your wrists and blood on your face, and I knew—" He paused, struggling for words. "I knew that if I walked away, I'd spend the rest of my life being the kind of man I'd promised myself I'd never become." "What kind of man is that?" "The kind who sees suffering and does nothing. The kind who lets fear turn him into a coward." Reed's grip tightened slightly. "I've been that man, Awanada. After Sarah died, I became exactly that. Turned my back on the world, on other people, on everything except my own grief. I won't be him anymore." Awanada turned her hands over, palms up, so their hands were properly clasped now. "You saved my life," she said softly. "Not just from that auction, but from what I was becoming. I was ready to die, Reed. In those mountains alone and starving, I had decided it was easier to let the cold take me than to keep fighting." Her eyes met his, dark and deep, and holding truths that made his chest ache. "But then you came. You gave me purpose again. Gave me reasons to wake up to work, to feel human." She paused. "You gave me hope I did not know I could still feel." The moment stretched between them, heavy with things neither quite knew how to name. Reed felt his heart hammering in his chest, felt the warmth of her hands in his, felt something breaking open inside him that he thought was sealed forever. "Awanada," he began, not sure what he wanted to say, knowing only that something needed to be said. But she pulled her hands back, gently, stood up and moved to the window where the first hints of dawn were painting the sky. "We should start the day," she said quietly. "Work will not do itself." Reed understood the retreat, respected it, even as part of him wanted to push forward into whatever territory they'd been approaching. Instead, he stood and began his morning routine, and they fell back into the comfortable patterns they'd established, though something hummed beneath the surface now, something electric and dangerous and impossibly fragile. They spent the morning reinforcing the cabin's defenses. Reed showed Awanada where he kept extra ammunition, taught her how to load and fire the spare rifle position supplies in strategic locations around the property. It felt like preparing for war, and maybe that's exactly what it was. "You know how to shoot?" Reed asked, watching her handle the rifle with surprising confidence. "My father taught me," Awanada said, "before the soldiers came. He said Apache women should know how to protect themselves, protect their families." She sighted down the barrel at an imaginary target. "I have not fired a gun in a long time, but the knowing is still here." She tapped her temple. "Some things the body does not forget." Reed set up targets in the backfield, old bottles and tin cans balanced on fence posts, and they spent an hour practicing. Awanada was rusty at first, but her aim improved quickly, muscle memory overriding time and trauma. By the end of the session, she was hitting more targets than she missed, and there was grim satisfaction in her expression. "Good," Reed said. "If Braddock comes back, I want you to be ready. Not because I think it'll come to shooting, I'll do everything in my power to prevent that, but because knowing you can defend yourself might make the difference between fear and confidence." Awanada lowered the rifle, her eyes serious. "I do not want to kill again," she said quietly. "I have killed before Reed, during the raids when soldiers came for my people. I killed to survive, to protect, and those deaths live in me like stones in my stomach." She looked at the rifle in her hands. "But I will do what I must. I will not be taken again. I will not be chained again. I would rather die fighting than live as property." "It won't come to that," Reed promised, though he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. They walked back to the cabin together, and Reed noticed how Awanada stayed close to his side, how their shoulders occasionally brushed, how the space between them had somehow become smaller over the past weeks without either of them consciously choosing it. That afternoon, while Reed was working on the irrigation ditch, he heard singing, soft and melodic words in a language he didn't understand, but that carried emotion so clearly no translation was needed. He followed the sound to the garden where Awanada was tending the vegetables she'd planted. Traditional crops she'd told him about, things her people had grown for generations. She didn't stop singing when she noticed him watching. If anything, her voice grew stronger, more confident, filling the space between earth and sky, with something that sounded like both mourning and celebration. When the song ended, Reed asked, "What was that, a growing song?" Awanada explained, her hands still working the soil. "My grandmother taught me. You sing to the plants, tell them they are strong, they are wanted, they will feed the people. It helps them grow better." She smiled slightly. "Or maybe it just helps the one planting them remember why they bother." "It was beautiful," Reed said, and meant it. Awanada looked up at him, dirt on her hands and sunlight in her hair, and Reed felt something shift in his chest, something profound and terrifying and undeniable. This wasn't just companionship anymore, wasn't just two lonely people finding comfort in shared space. This was something deeper, something that made him think about futures he'd stopped imagining a decade ago. "Will you teach me?" he heard himself ask. The song, surprise, flickered across Awanada's face, followed by something warmer. "You want to learn Apache growing song?" "I want to learn anything you're willing to teach," Reed said honestly. So she taught him, repeating the phrases slowly while he stumbled through pronunciation, laughing gently when he mangled the sounds, but encouraging him to keep trying. By the end of the afternoon, Reed could manage a rough approximation of the first verse, and Awanada's laughter had become something genuine and unguarded, something that made the world feel lighter. That evening, they sat on the porch, as had become their custom, watching the sun set fire to the western sky. The air was cooler now, carrying the promise of autumn, and Awanada had wrapped herself in one of Sarah's old shawls. "Tell me about your wife," she said suddenly. "Not the sad parts, the good parts. Who was she before sickness took her?" Reed was quiet for a long moment, caught between the instinct to keep Sarah's memory private and the desire to share her with someone who might understand. Finally, he spoke. "Sarah was light," he said. "I don't know how else to describe it. She had this way of finding joy in small things, a good sunrise bread rising properly, wildflowers growing in unlikely places. She believed people were fundamentally good even when the world showed her otherwise." Reed smiled, remembering. "She used to tell me I thought too much worried, too much carried, too much weight on my shoulders. She'd make me dance with her in the kitchen for no reason, or she'd surprise me by abandoning all her chores to go swimming in the creek." His voice softened. "She made me better than I was, made me want to be the kind of man she believed I could be." "You loved her very much," Awanada said. "It wasn't a question." "More than my own life," Reed confirmed. "When she died, I wanted to follow her. Didn't see the point in staying in a world she wasn't in anymore." He looked at Awanada. "I'm not sure what stopped me. Cowardice, maybe. Or some stubborn part of me that refused to quit even when quitting made more sense." Awanada nodded slowly. "My husband was named Nahiosi. It means he who stands firm. He was warrior but also gentle. He carved things from wood animals, birds, small toys for children." Her voice grew distant. When the soldiers came, he told me to run to hide to survive. His last words to me were, "Live even if living hurts." So I did. I lived, but for a long time I did not know why. "And now?" Reed asked quietly. Awanada turned to look at him fully, and in the fading light, her eyes were impossibly deep. "Now I think maybe I understand what he meant. Living is not just breathing, not just surviving day to day. Living is finding reasons to wake up to work to hope." She paused. "Living is choosing to let new people into the spaces where old people used to be." Reed felt his breath catch. "Awanada, I am not her," Awanada interrupted gently. "I will never be her. I am a different person with different history, different pain, but maybe—" She struggled for words. "Maybe there is room in your life for different. Maybe there is room for me not as replacement but as new chapter." Reed reached out slowly and took her hand, and this time neither of them pulled away. They sat like that as darkness fell around them. Hands clasped, two people who'd both loved and lost. Learning that the heart's capacity for connection didn't die with the first great love, but could impossibly expand to hold more. "There's room," Reed said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "There's so much room." The days that followed carried a different quality, as if the air itself had changed composition. Reed and Awanada moved around each other with new awareness, their casual touches lingering longer, their glances holding more weight. The work continued, it always did, but now it felt less like survival and more like building something worth protecting. One morning, Reed found Awanada in the barn, braiding Copper's mane with the ribbons he'd bought her in town. The old gelding stood patiently while she worked her fingers, moving with practiced skill, and Reed felt a surge of tenderness so powerful it nearly knocked him over. "He looks handsome," Reed said, announcing his presence. Awanada smiled without turning. "He is vain horse. He likes to be pretty." Reed moved closer, watching her hands work. "My mother used to braid my sister's hair like that. Before the war, before everything fell apart. She'd sit on the porch and work for hours, making these elaborate patterns while my sister complained and fidgeted." The memory came unexpectedly, carrying more sweetness than pain. "I haven't thought about that in years." "You have sister?" Awanada asked, glancing at him. "Had," Reed corrected gently. "Cholera took her the same year it took Sarah. Sometimes it feels like the disease took my whole world in one sweep." Awanada finished the braid and turned to face him fully. "But world rebuilt itself," she said, slowly with much pain but still rebuilding. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers light against his weathered skin. "You are here. I am here. That is something." Reed covered her hand with his own, holding it against his cheek, and the gesture felt more intimate than anything he'd experienced in a decade. "It's everything," he whispered. They stood like that in the quiet barn, sunlight streaming through gaps in the walls, the smell of hay and horses surrounding them, and Reed felt the last walls around his heart beginning to crumble. He'd built those walls carefully after Sarah died, brick by brick of isolation and grief, convinced that never feeling again was the only way to avoid being destroyed by feeling. But Awanada was patient dynamite, dismantling his defenses not through force, but through simple, persistent presence. Through shared work and quiet evenings and small acts of trust that accumulated into something transformative. "Reed," she said softly, and he heard question and invitation in the way she spoke his name. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and pressed his forehead against hers. They breathed together for a long moment, close enough that he could count her eyelashes, could see the faint scar above her left eyebrow, could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "I'm afraid," Reed admitted. "Afraid of carrying this much again. Afraid of losing someone else. Afraid of—" "I am afraid too," Awanada interrupted. "Fear does not go away just because we wish it, but maybe—" She pulled back slightly to meet his eyes. "Maybe we are less afraid together than apart." Reed cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones, and knew he was standing at a crossroads. He could step back, could maintain the safe distance of friendship, and nothing more could protect his heart by never fully opening it again. Or he could step forward into territory that terrified him, could choose hope over safety, could risk everything for the possibility of something real. His lips found hers with a gentleness that surprised them both. The kiss was tentative at first, careful two people learning each other's language through touch. But then Awanada made a soft sound in her throat and pressed closer, her hands gripping his shirt, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like both question and answer, both confession and promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Awanada smiled a real smile, full and genuine and so beautiful it made Reed's chest ache. "Well," she said, slightly breathless, "that was worth being afraid for." Reed laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy that echoed in the barn. "Yeah," he agreed. "Yeah, it really was." They stood there grinning at each other like fools until Copper nickered impatiently, reminding them that horses still needed tending regardless of human revelations. They returned to their work, but everything felt different now, charged with possibility, humming with potential alive, in ways that made even mundane tasks feel sacred. That night, they sat closer on the porch, Awanada's head on Reed's shoulder, his arm around her waist, both of them watching stars emerge against the darkening sky. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. The silence between them had become its own language, communicating things words could never capture. But comfort never lasted long in Reed's experience, and trouble had a way of finding you even when you were finally happy. The trouble returned 2 weeks later in the form of fire. Reed woke to Copper's panicked whinnying and the acrid smell of smoke. He bolted from bed, grabbed his rifle out of pure instinct, and ran outside to find the barn engulfed in flames. Orange and red danced against the black sky, eating through dry wood with terrifying speed. "Awanada!" he shouted, running back toward the cabin. She was already emerging, her eyes wide with fear and fury. "The horses!" she cried. Reed thrust the rifle into her hands. "Watch the perimeter. This wasn't an accident. Someone set this." He didn't wait for confirmation, just ran toward the burning barn, while Awanada took up position with the weapon, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The heat was overwhelming, a physical wall that pushed against Reed as he burst through the barn door. Smoke filled his lungs, making him cough and gasp. He could hear Copper screaming in terror, could hear the other horses kicking against their stalls. Reed grabbed a saddle blanket and covered his mouth, then fought his way to Copper's stall. The old gelding was wild-eyed with panic, but he knew Reed's voice, trusted Reed's hands. "Easy, boy." Reed gasped, fumbling with the latch. "I got you. Come on now." He freed Copper and slapped the horse's rump, sending him charging out into the night. Then he moved to the other two horses, both younger and more volatile. The heat was unbearable now, the smoke so thick he could barely see. His hands fumbled with latches. He normally could work blind, his coordination failing as oxygen deprivation scrambled his thoughts. The second horse freed and bolted. Reed staggered to the third stall just as a burning beam crashed down behind him, cutting off his exit. He got the last horse out through the hole the beam had created, but now he was trapped flames on 3 sides and no clear path forward. "Reed!" Awanada's voice cut through the roar of fire. "Get clear, it!" he shouted back, looking desperately for any way out. The smoke was overwhelming now, each breath like inhaling broken glass. He could feel consciousness starting to slip away, could feel his body shutting down from heat and lack of air. Then hands were on him, strong, determined hands, pulling him backward through the flames. Awanada had wrapped herself in wet blankets and plunged into the inferno, and she was dragging him toward where flames were thinnest. Reed tried to help, tried to move his legs, but his body wasn't cooperating anymore. They burst out into the night air and collapsed together, both coughing violently, both singed and burned, and lucky to be alive. Reed's lungs felt like they'd been scraped raw. His hands were blistered, but he was alive. "You stupid man!" Awanada gasped, her face streaked with ash and tears. "You almost died." "Horses," Reed managed to rasp. "Fuck the horses." Awanada grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. "You could have died. You could have left me alone again." She was crying now, really crying, and Reed realized with stunning clarity how much he meant to her, how much she'd invested in this fragile bond they'd built. He pulled her against his chest, holding her while the barn burned itself out behind them, while everything he'd built over the years turned to ash and smoke. But he was alive. She was alive. The horses were safe. Everything else could be rebuilt. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I'm sorry." They sat there in the dirt watching the barn collapse in on itself with a thunderous crash that sent sparks swirling into the night sky like demonic fireflies. Reed's mind was already working through the implications. Someone had done this deliberately. Braddock? Or his men? Or maybe just someone from town who didn't like the idea of an Apache woman living free. "This is because of me," Awanada said, voicing what they were both thinking. "They are punishing you for keeping me." "They're showing me they can hurt what I care about," Reed corrected grimly. "But all they've done is prove I was right to be worried." He turned to face her, his soot-covered face serious in the firelight. "Awanada, I need you to listen. This is going to get worse before it gets better. These people, Braddock and whoever's with him, they won't stop. They'll keep pushing, keep testing, keep trying to drive you away, or drive me to give you up." "Well, then I will leave," Awanada said immediately. "I will not let you lose everything because of me." "No," Reed said firmly. "Absolutely not. You're not going anywhere." He gripped her shoulders. "Listen to me. I've lost too much in my life already. I've buried too many people, said goodbye to too many things I loved. I won't do it again. I won't let them win by making me too afraid to stand up for what's right." "But your barn is wood and nails," Reed interrupted. "It can be rebuilt. You can't be. We can't be." He pulled her close again. "I'm done running from the world, done hiding from connection because I'm afraid of loss. If they want to take you from me, they'll have to kill me first. And I promise you, that won't be as easy as they think." Awanada trembled against him, and Reed held her tighter, held her like she was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. Around them, the fire continued its work of destruction, but in the ruins, something else was being forged. A commitment stronger than fear, a determination that wouldn't bend to threats or violence, or the casual cruelty of men who thought power gave them the right to crush what they didn't understand. As dawn broke over the destroyed barn, painting the sky in colors that mocked the previous night's flames, Reed and Awanada stood together surveying the damage. It was bad, worse than he'd initially thought. The barn was total loss. Tools were destroyed. Supplies were ruined. The winter stores he'd been accumulating were ash. But the cabin still stood. The fences still held. The land endured. And they were alive together, choosing each other in the face of everything trying to tear them apart. "We'll need to go to town," Reed said, his voice hoarse from smoke. "Report this to someone besides Braddock. Maybe the territorial marshal if I can find him. And we'll need supplies to rebuild." "They will not be happy to see us," Awanada said. "I don't care about their happiness," Reed replied. "I care about justice and rebuilding and making sure whoever did this knows we won't be intimidated." He looked at her, at this woman who'd run into fire to save him, who'd chosen to stay, despite every reason to run. "Will you come with me?" Awanada met his eyes steadily. "Yes," she said. "I will face them. I will show them I am not afraid." "Even though you are—" "Especially because I am," Awanada said. "Fear that makes you run is prison. Fear that makes you stand is power." Reed nodded, respect and love surging through him in equal measure. "Then we stand together." They spent the morning cleaning up what could be salvaged and making the property as secure as possible. Reed showed Awanada where he kept his money, hidden in a false bottom of his trunk, and made her memorize the location of everything important. "If something happens to me," he said, ignoring her protest, "if I end up dead or in jail or unable to come back, I need you to know where things are. The ranch deed is in the metal box under the floorboard in my room. The money's in the trunk. There's a rifle and ammunition buried in an oilcloth behind the chicken coop." He gripped her hands. "Promise me if the worst happens, you'll take what you need and head north. There are settlements up there, places far enough from Redstone that you could start over." "I will not leave you," Awanada said stubbornly. "If I'm dead, you won't be leaving me. You'll be honoring my last wish." Reed's voice was hard. "Promise me." Awanada's eyes blazed with anger and fear and something fiercer. "I promise," she said finally. "But you will not die. We will not let them win." They rode into Redstone Crossing in the afternoon, both still bearing the marks of the previous night's fire. Reed's hands were bandaged. Awanada's face bore fresh burns on one cheek. They looked like they'd been through war, and in a sense, they had been. The town square was busy when they arrived, and conversations died as they passed. Reed felt the weight of every stare, every whispered comment, every judgment passing like poison through the air. But he kept his spine straight and his eyes forward, and beside him, Awanada did the same. They tied their horses outside the marshal's office, not Braddock's territory, but federal land, and Reed pushed through the door with Awanada at his back. The man behind the desk looked up with mild curiosity that turned to interest when he saw their condition. He was older, maybe 50, with gray threading through his dark hair and eyes that had seen too much to be easily shocked. "Help you?" he asked. "My name is Reed Holston. I own a ranch about an hour outside town. Last night someone set fire to my barn, deliberately. I'm here to file a formal complaint and request an investigation." The marshal leaned back in his chair, his eyes moving between Reed and Awanada. "That's a serious accusation. You got proof it was arson." "Proof enough," Reed said. "No storm, no lightning, no logical reason for the fire except someone wanted to hurt me." He paused. "Or hurt her." "The Apache woman," the marshal said, recognition dawning. "Heard about you buying her at auction. Caused quite a stir." "She has a name," Reed said firmly. "Awanada. And she's a free woman living on my property by choice. If someone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me directly instead of burning my property like cowards." The marshal studied them both for a long moment, and Reed couldn't read what he was thinking. Finally, he spoke. "I'll look into it. But I'm going to be honest with you, Holston. Proving arson is tough, and even if I can prove it, finding the culprit is tougher. You're not popular right now, keeping an Apache when everyone else is trying to clear them out. You're making people uncomfortable." "Good," Reed said flatly. "They should be uncomfortable. Their comfort comes at the price of human dignity, and I won't participate in it." Something that might have been respect flickered across the marshal's face. "Fair enough. Give me your statement, and I'll see what I can do." Reed laid out the facts while the marshal took notes. When he finished, the older man sat back and sighed. "I'll investigate. Can't promise results, but I'll try." He looked at Awanada. "You got anything to add, miss?" Awanada had been silent throughout Reed's statement, but now she spoke, her voice clear and strong despite her accent. "I have done nothing wrong. I hurt no one. I work the land, I live quietly. I ask only to be left in peace." She leaned forward. "But men like Braddock, they cannot let me have peace. Because if I am free, if I am human, then everything they did to my people becomes harder to justify. So they attack, they burn. They try to make me afraid enough to disappear." Her eyes blazed. "But I will not disappear. I will not make it easy for them to forget what they have done." The marshal looked at her for a long moment, and Reed saw genuine respect in his expression. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I don't suppose you will." They left the office feeling not quite victorious, but at least heard. Reed led Awanada to the general store where they purchased supplies for rebuilding Nail's lumber canvas for temporary shelter. The store owner was cold but professional, taking their money without comment. As they loaded supplies onto their horses, a voice called out behind them, "Holston!" Reed turned to find the preacher approaching, his face creased with concern. "Heard about your barn. Terrible thing. Just terrible." "Yeah," Reed said warily. "It was." The preacher glanced at Awanada, then back to Reed. "You know, if you need help rebuilding, there are men in the congregation who'd be willing to—" "No," Reed interrupted. "Thank you, but no. We'll manage on our own." The preacher's face tightened. "Pride's a sin, Holston. So is—" He gestured vaguely at Awanada. "Whatever this is you're doing here." Reed felt anger flash through him. "Whatever this is, she's a person. Her name is Awanada. She works my land, shares my home, and has more courage and dignity than most of your congregation combined." He stepped closer. "You want to talk about sin? Let's talk about men who preach love and compassion on Sunday, then turn around and treat other human beings like animals to be bought and sold. Let's talk about the sin of standing by while injustice happens because it's convenient or comfortable or profitable." The preacher's face flushed red. "You're treading dangerous ground." "I'm treading the only ground that matters," Reed shot back. "The ground where actions match words and principles actually mean something." He turned back to his horse. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a barn to rebuild." They rode out of town with supplies and stares following them, and Reed felt something settle in his chest, a kind of fierce pride mixed with resignation. He'd made his stand public now. There was no going back, no pretending this was temporary or casual. He'd claimed Awanada in front of the town, had defended her with words that couldn't be taken back or misunderstood. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Both of them processing what had happened in town, what Reed had said, what it all meant for the precarious future they were trying to build. The sun was high and merciless, turning the landscape into something shimmering and surreal, and Reed found himself acutely aware of every detail, the way Awanada sat in the saddle with natural grace, the dried sweat marks on Copper's flanks, the weight of the supplies they carried that represented both reconstruction and defiance. When they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Reed felt his chest tighten. The burned shell of the barn stood like a monument to everything they were up against. Blackened timbers reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. But the cabin still stood solid, and whole smoke rising from the chimney where he'd left a fire bank that morning, and something about that continuity gave him strength. They unloaded supplies in heavy silence, stacking lumber near where the barn had stood, organizing tools with the methodical care of people who needed concrete tasks to keep darker thoughts at bay. Reed was hammering stakes to mark where the new structure would rise when Awanada's voice cut through his concentration. "Reed, someone is coming." He looked up sharply to see a single rider approaching from the east, moving at an easy pace that suggested neither threat nor urgency. As the figure grew closer, Reed recognized him. Tom Whitaker, a neighboring rancher who'd always been cordial, if not exactly friendly. Reed wiped sweat from his face and waited, one hand resting casually near his hip where his pistol sat. Awanada moved to stand beside him, her presence solid and reassuring. Whitaker reined in his horse about 20 feet away, his eyes taking in the destroyed barn, the burn marks the evidence of recent violence. He was a weathered man in his 50s, lean and hard from decades of ranch work, with a face that looked like it had been carved from saddle leather. "Holston," he said by way of greeting. Then with a nod toward Awanada, "Ma'am." "Whitaker," Reed replied cautiously. "What brings you out here?" The older man shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable. "Heard about your barn. Heard some other things, too, about why it might have burned." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not here to make trouble or pass judgment. Just wanted to say, what happened to you ain't right. Man's property is his own, and what he does on it is his business." Reed felt surprise ripple through him. "That's not the sentiment I've been getting from most folks." "Most folks are idiots," Whitaker said bluntly. "They get an idea in their heads about how things should be and can't see past it to what's actually true." He looked at Awanada directly. "I fought Apaches during the wars, lost friends to raids, got my own scars and my own anger about it all. But I also know that painting every individual with the same brush is lazy thinking." He turned back to Reed. "You vouch for her character." "With my life," Reed said without hesitation. Whitaker nodded slowly. "That's good enough for me." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Brought you some nails and a bottle of decent whiskey. Figure you could use both for rebuilding, one for the barn, one for the spirit." Reed felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Whitaker said, "but I wanted to. Sometimes a man needs to know he's not standing alone even when it feels like the whole world's against him." He tossed the bundle down and Reed caught it. "You need help with the actual building, you send word. I've got hands that can swing hammers and keep their mouths shut." "Why?" Awanada asked. Suddenly, her voice cutting through the moment. "Why do you help us when others would celebrate our suffering?" Whitaker looked at her for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "Because my wife was Mexican back when that was nearly as scandalous as what you two have going on. We caught hell for it, lost friends, lost business, had our property vandalized more times than I can count." His voice roughened with old pain. "She died 5 years back. And I'll tell you something, I regret a lot of things in my life, but standing by her through all that hatred ain't one of them. It made us stronger, made me remember what really matters when everything else gets stripped away. He gathered his reins. I see you two looking at each other the way me and Maria used to. That's worth protecting, worth fighting for. Don't let the bastards take it from you. With that, he turned his horse and rode away, leaving Reed and Awanada standing in stunned silence, holding a bundle of nails and whiskey and unexpected hope. There are good people, Awanada said quietly, watching Whitaker disappear over the ridge. Even here, even now, there are still good people. Yeah, Reed agreed, his voice rough. Yeah, there are. They returned to their work with renewed determination. The barn wouldn't rebuild itself, and autumn was advancing steadily, bringing with it the promise of winter and all the challenges that would entail. Reed sketched plans in the dirt with a stick, showing Awanada his vision for the new structure, smaller than before, more practical, easier to defend if it came to that. Here we'll put the horses, he explained, drawing crude stalls, and here we'll store hay and grain. This corner can be for tools, and this section, he paused, meeting her eyes. This section we'll make into a workshop, somewhere warm and dry, where you can work on your medicines, where we can fix things during winter storms. Awanada knelt beside him, studying the plans. You think of everything, she said. I try, Reed replied, though I'm better at planning buildings than I am at planning lives. He sat back on his heels. Awanada, there's something we need to talk about. Something I should have brought up before but kept finding reasons to avoid. Concern flickered across her face. What? Reed took a deep breath. What are we doing here? I mean, really doing? Are you staying because you don't have anywhere else to go, or because you want to be here? Are we building something real, or are we just two damaged people finding comfort in proximity? He forced himself to meet her eyes. Because I need to know. I need to know if what I'm feeling is shared or if I'm fooling myself into hoping for something that can't exist. Awanada was quiet for so long, Reed thought he'd made a terrible mistake by asking. Then she reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, in a gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks. When I was in the mountains starving and alone, I used to imagine what it would feel like to simply stop, she said softly. To lay down in the snow and let cold take me, let all the pain and running and loss finally end. Her grip tightened. But something kept pushing me forward, kept telling me there was still something worth surviving for, even if I could not see it yet. She turned to face him fully. Then you came. You with your sad eyes and careful hands, and the way you moved through the world like a man carrying ghosts. And slowly, day by day, I began to understand what that something was. What? Reed whispered. The possibility of healing. Not forgetting, not replacing what was lost, but learning to live with the scars in a way that makes them part of the story, instead of the end of it. Awanada brought his hand to her chest, pressed it over her heart. I feel things for you that terrify me. Things I thought died with Nahiosi. And yes, I am here partially because I have nowhere else to go. But I stay because when I imagine leaving, when I imagine being anywhere you are not, it feels like choosing death over life. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Is that real enough for you? Reed cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. It's everything, he said hoarsely. It's more than I thought I deserved to hear. He leaned forward and kissed her, soft and deep and full of promise, and when they broke apart, both were breathing hard. I love you. Reed said the words foreign on his tongue after so many years of silence. I don't know when it happened or how, but somewhere between the auction yard and right now I fell completely in love with you. Awanada's smile was incandescent. I love you too, she said, her accent making the words sound like music. Even though I did not want to, even though I fought against it, even though every instinct told me to protect my heart. She laughed, half crying. But the heart does not listen to instincts. It chooses its own path. They held each other in the shadow of the destroyed barn, two people who'd both loved and lost, learning that the capacity for love didn't diminish with use, but actually expanded, making room for new connections without erasing old ones. Sarah and Nahiosi would always be part of their histories, ghosts that shaped but no longer haunted them. This was something new, something built on shared survival and mutual respect and the recognition of kindred spirits. That night they made love for the first time, slow and careful and tender in Reed's small bed, with moonlight streaming through the window. It wasn't wild or desperate, but rather deliberate, a conscious choice to be vulnerable with each other, to trust each other with the most intimate parts of themselves. Afterward, they lay tangled together, skin against skin, breathing synchronized, and Reed felt more at peace than he had since before the war. "Stay with me," he whispered into her hair. "Not just tonight, not just until spring, but always. Build this life with me. Make this ranch into something that belongs to both of us." Awanada propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him with dark eyes that held entire universes. "You are asking me to be your wife," she said, not quite a question. "Yes," Reed said simply. "I know we can't do it legally, not without causing more trouble than we're already in. But in every way that matters in our hearts and our actions and our commitment to each other, yes, I'm asking you to be my wife." "There is child," Awanada said suddenly, the words dropping between them like stones in still water. Reed's mind went blank. "What?" "I carry child," Awanada said, her hand moving to her stomach in an unconscious gesture of protection. "Your child. It has been growing for maybe 6-7 weeks. I felt the changes, knew the signs, but I was—" She struggled for words. "I was afraid to say. Afraid you would think I was trapping you, or that I did this deliberately to secure my place here." Reed sat up slowly, his mind racing. A child. His child, their child. The concept was so enormous, so world-altering, that he couldn't quite process it. "How long have you known?" he managed. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Awanada said, watching his face carefully for signs of rejection or anger. "I kept meaning to tell you, but each day that passed made it harder, made me more afraid of your reaction." Reed reached out and placed his hand over hers on her stomach, feeling the flatness there that would soon swell with life. His child. A piece of him and a piece of her combined into something entirely new. After Sarah's death, he'd given up on the idea of children, of family, of any future that included small hands and midnight feedings, and teaching someone else how to navigate the world. "Reed," Awanada's voice was small, uncertain. "Say something." He looked up at her, saw the fear and hope warring in her expression, and felt his heart crack open even wider. "I'm going to be a father," he said, wonder creeping into his voice. "We're going to have a baby." Relief flooded Awanada's face. "You are not angry." "Angry." Reed pulled her against him, held her tight. "I'm terrified and thrilled and completely overwhelmed, but angry. Never." He pulled back to look at her seriously. "This changes things, though. Makes everything more urgent, more important. We need to make this place secure. We need to figure out how to protect you both. We need to breathe," Awanada interrupted gently. "And trust that we will figure it out together one day at a time." She smiled. "We have months before baby comes. Time to prepare, time to build, time to make ready." Reed nodded, but his mind was already spinning through implications and challenges. A pregnant woman would be even more vulnerable than she already was. And a child, a half Apache, half white child born to unmarried parents, would face prejudice from birth. They'd need legal protection, social allies, resources. Reed wasn't sure he could provide, but he'd figure it out. They'd figure it out. Because the alternative, losing either of them, failing to protect what they were building, was unthinkable. "Then we get married," Reed said firmly. "Tomorrow. In whatever way we can that makes it real, that makes it binding in our eyes, even if the law won't recognize it." Awanada looked surprised. "How?" "I don't know yet," Reed admitted. "But we'll find a way. We'll create our own ceremony, speak our own vows, make our own commitments. And then we'll make this ranch into a home for our family, build something strong enough to weather whatever storms come our way." The next morning, Reed went to the small trunk where he kept his most precious possessions and pulled out a slim metal box he hadn't opened in a decade. Inside was Sarah's wedding ring, simple gold, worn thin from years of wear, inscribed with words that had once meant everything. He held it up to the light, feeling the weight of memory and new possibility. I want you to have this, he said, showing it to Awanada. Not to replace Sarah or pretend she didn't exist, but to honor what she meant to me while also acknowledging what you mean now. He turned the ring in his fingers. Sarah would have liked you, I think, would have respected your strength, your courage, your refusal to be broken by things that should have destroyed you. Awanada took the ring carefully, examining the inscription. What does it say? Love endures, Reed translated. We chose those words because we believed love was the one constant in a changing world, the one thing that could survive any challenge. He paused. I still believe that. But I understand now that love doesn't just endure, it transforms, grows, makes room for new chapters without erasing old ones. It is beautiful, Awanada said softly. But are you certain this was hers? Is her memory? And now it's yours, Reed interrupted gently. Because memory isn't diminished by being shared, it's honored. He took her hand. Will you wear it? Will you be my wife in every way that matters? Legal recognition be damned. Awanada's eyes shone with tears. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will. Reed slipped the ring onto her finger, and though it was slightly too large, it looked right there, looked like it belonged. They stood in the morning light streaming through the cabin window, and Reed felt the presence of both past and future, pressing close, bearing witness to this moment of transformation. We should make it official, Awanada said. Not just between us, but before something greater. Before the land, before the sky, before whatever spirits watch over people like us who stumble through darkness looking for light. So they walked out onto the property. They were slowly making their own past the burned remains of the barn, past the fences they'd mended together, past the garden where plants grew strong from Awanada's care and singing. They walked until they reached the small rise behind the cabin where Sarah's grave marker stood, surrounded by wildflowers. Reed hadn't been to the grave in weeks, had found that his daily pilgrimages of grief had faded as new life pushed out old mourning. But standing here now with Awanada felt right, felt like closing one chapter so another could properly begin. Sarah, Reed said quietly, speaking to the marker and the memory it represented. I want you to meet Awanada. She's strong and brave and probably too good for me, but somehow she's chosen to stay anyway. He paused, emotion thick in his throat. I love her, Sarah. Not the way I loved you, nothing could be exactly the same, but just as deeply, just as truly. And we're going to have a baby. We're going to build the family you and I always dreamed of, just in a way neither of us could have imagined. He took a shaky breath. I hope you understand. I hope you're not disappointed or hurt. I hope you know that loving her doesn't mean forgetting you. Awanada knelt beside the marker and placed her hand on the stone. She spoke in Apache words Reed couldn't understand, but whose sentiment came through clearly: respect, gratitude, a request for blessing, or at least acceptance. When she finished, she stood and took Reed's hand. She knows, Awanada said with quiet certainty. And she approves. I feel it. Reed wasn't sure if he believed in spirits or afterlife, or any of the comforting stories people told themselves about death. But standing there with Awanada's hand in his and morning sun warming his face, he chose to believe that somehow, somewhere Sarah knew and was happy for him. Was happy he'd found a way to keep living instead of just surviving. They spoke their vows there, simple and direct. No official presiding, no legal witness, just two people making promises to each other in the presence of land and sky and memory. Reed promised to protect, provide, and cherish. Awanada promised to stand beside him to build their home, to face whatever challenges came with courage and love. They promised to raise their child with respect for both their heritages, to teach strength and compassion in equal measure, to create something better than either had known before. When the words were finished, Reed kissed his wife because that's what she was now, legal recognition or not, and felt the last pieces of his broken heart finally knit themselves back together stronger for having been shattered and remade. They spent the rest of the day working on the new barn, their movements synchronized in the way of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. Whitaker's nails proved invaluable, and the lumber they'd purchased in town began taking shape under their combined efforts. It was slow work, physically demanding, but satisfying in the way that building always was taking raw materials and transforming them into something functional and lasting. By sunset, they had the frame's foundation laid and several support beams raised. It didn't look like much yet, but Reed could see its potential, could imagine it complete and serving its purpose. Like their relationship, like their life together, rough and unfinished now, but holding the promise of something solid. They were cleaning tools when Reed heard horses approaching, multiple horses moving fast. His hand went instinctively to his rifle, and Awanada moved to his side without being asked, her own weapon ready. But it wasn't Braddock or his men who appeared over the ridge. It was Whitaker again, accompanied by 3 other men Reed recognized from neighboring properties. They pulled up in a cloud of dust, all of them armed, all of them wearing expressions of grim determination. "What's wrong?" Reed called out, tension singing through his body. "Braddock's gathering a posse," Whitaker said without preamble. "Says he's got evidence that your woman was involved in the horse theft up north, says he's coming to take her in for questioning." His face was hard. "It's bullshit, of course. Everyone knows it, but he's got enough men drinking his lies that he'll have numbers on his side." Reed felt ice flood his veins. Tonight most likely, tomorrow morning at the latest." Whitaker gestured to the men with him. "That's why we're here. Figured you could use some extra guns, some extra bodies to make it clear that taking her won't be as easy as Braddock thinks." Reed stared at them, these near strangers who were risking their own safety and reputation to help him. "Why?" he asked hoarsely. "Why would you do this?" One of the other men spoke up, Pete Harrison, a rancher Reed had spoken to maybe twice in his life. "Because I'm tired of watching bullies get their way just because nobody has the guts to stand up to them. Because what Braddock's doing is wrong, and sometimes a man has to pick a side even when it's not convenient. Because right is right," the third man added simply. He was younger, maybe 30, with earnest eyes. "My name's Jack Morrison. My family came from Ireland during the famine, and I remember what it was like being treated as less than human just for being different. I won't stand by while it happens to someone else." The fourth man, older and grizzled, just nodded. "Plus Tom here says your woman can cook. Figure standing watch through the night might earn us a decent meal." Despite the tension, Reed felt a laugh bubble up. "She can cook," he confirmed, "and she can shoot too if it comes to that." "Let's hope it doesn't," Whitaker said, "but either way, you're not alone in this fight." They formed a perimeter around the property as darkness fell, taking turns on watch while others rested. Owanada prepared food stew and cornbread and coffee strong enough to fuel a long night, and Reed watched her move through the cabin with quiet efficiency, her hand occasionally drifting to her stomach in that protective gesture he was learning to recognize. He pulled her aside while the others were eating. "If things go bad tonight," he said quietly, "if shooting starts, I need you to take Copper and run. Head north like we discussed. Don't look back. Don't wait for me." "No," Awanada interrupted firmly. "We have had this conversation. I do not run. I do not leave you. We stand together or we fall together, but we do not separate." Her eyes blazed. "I am done running, Reed, done hiding, done being afraid. Whatever happens tonight, whatever comes tomorrow, we face it as one." Reed wanted to argue, wanted to physically force her to safety if necessary, but he saw the steel in her expression and knew it would be pointless. She'd made her choice just as he'd made his, and all he could do was honor it. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, but you stay inside the cabin where there's cover. You stay safe for the baby, if not for me." "For all of us," Awanada corrected. "For the family we are building." The night stretched long and tense. Reed took first watch with Harrison, both of them positioned where they could see the main approach to the property. The autumn air was cold now, sharp with the promise of winter, and Reed pulled his coat tighter while his eyes scanned the darkness for movement. "How long you been alone out here?" Harrison asked after a while, his voice low. 10 years, huh?" Reed replied. "Since my wife died." "That's a long time to carry grief by yourself." "Yeah," Reed agreed. "Too long, probably. Started forgetting what it felt like to be human, to connect with anyone beyond surface pleasantries." He glanced toward the cabin where lamplight glowed warm in the windows. "Awanada reminded me. Forced me to remember that isolation isn't the same as safety, that walls around your heart don't protect you, they just slowly suffocate you." Harrison nodded slowly. "My wife left me 3 years back. Couldn't take the loneliness of ranch life, couldn't stand the distance from civilization. She went back east, and I haven't heard from her since. He paused. I could have gone with her, could have given up this life and tried to make her happy. But I didn't, and I've regretted it ever since. So when Tom said you needed help protecting something you love well, he shrugged. Seemed like maybe I could do for you what I didn't do for myself. They fell back into silence, but it was companionable now, the shared understanding of men who'd both learned hard lessons about what mattered and what didn't. The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Reed rotated watch positions, checked on Awanada, drank coffee that had gone cold hours ago, and waited for trouble that might or might not come. Around 3 a.m, when exhaustion was pulling at him like physical weight, Morrison called out softly from his position. Movement. East Ridge. Multiple riders. Reed's fatigue vanished instantly, replaced by sharp, clear alertness. He moved to Morrison's position and saw what the younger man had spotted. Maybe a dozen riders silhouetted against the star-filled sky, moving slowly and deliberately toward the ranch. Wake the others, Reed said quietly, and get Awanada into the root cellar. I don't care if she argues physically, carry her if you have to. But Awanada was already emerging from the cabin, rifle in hand, her face set with determination. I told you, she said. We stand together. Reed didn't have time to argue. The riders were getting closer, and he needed to position everyone for maximum defensive advantage. He put Awanada behind the water trough, where she'd have solid cover, placed Whitaker and Morrison on the flanks, kept Harrison beside him in the center position. The riders stopped about 50 yards out, just beyond easy rifle range, but close enough for voices to carry. Braddock sat his horse in the center of the group, his badge glinting in the moonlight. "Holston!" he called out. "We know you're there. We know you're armed. We don't want trouble, but we will have that Apache woman. She's wanted for questioning about crimes committed up north." "She's innocent, and you know it," Reed shouted back. "This is harassment, pure and simple. You're not taking her anywhere." "You're harboring a fugitive," Braddock countered. "That makes you complicit. Makes you liable for arrest yourself. Last chance, Holston, send her out and we'll go peaceful. Force our hand and people will get hurt." Reed could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, could taste copper fear in the back of his throat. But beneath the fear was something harder, something that had been forged through months of choosing love over safety, connection over isolation. "No," he said clearly. "She stays with me. She's my wife. She's carrying my child. And if you want her, you'll have to go through me. Through all of us." He heard Whitaker and the others shifting positions, heard the unmistakable sound of rifles being readied, and knew his allies were backing his play, even though it might cost them everything. Braddock sat silent for a long moment, and Reed could almost see the calculation happening, weighing the value of his vendetta against the risk of actual violence, measuring his pride against his self-preservation. "You're making a mistake," Braddock said finally. "I've made plenty of mistakes in my life," Reed replied, "but standing up for someone I love isn't one of them." Another long pause. Then to Reed's shock, Braddock turned his horse. "Let's go," he said to his men. "This isn't worth getting shot over." The posse retreated into the darkness, and Reed felt his legs nearly give out from released tension. Beside him, Harrison let out a shaky laugh. "Holy hell," he muttered. "I really thought we were about to have a war." "Maybe we did," Whitaker said thoughtfully. "Just a different kind. The kind where showing you're willing to fight sometimes means you don't have to." Awanada emerged from behind the water trough, and Reed pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight he could feel her heartbeat against his chest. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "You're safe, we're safe." "For now," Awanada said, ever practical. "But he will try again. Men like Braddock do not give up easily." "Then we'll be ready," Reed said. "However many times it takes, we'll be ready." As dawn broke over the ranch, painting everything in shades of gold and rose, Reed's unlikely defenders prepared to leave. He tried to offer payment, tried to find words adequate to express his gratitude, but they all waved him off. "You'd do the same for us," Whitaker said simply. "That's what neighbors do, stand together when it matters." They rode away as the sun climbed higher, and Reed and Awanada stood watching until they disappeared. Two people who'd learned that sometimes salvation came from unexpected quarters, that sometimes the world contained more goodness than cynicism wanted to acknowledge. "Come on," Reed said finally, leading Awanada back toward the cabin. "We've got a barn to finish and a life to build, and we're burning daylight." She smiled and followed him, one hand on her stomach, one hand reaching for his choosing hope over fear and love over safety, just like she had every day since a scarred farmer had looked at her in an auction yard and decided that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The weeks following Braddock's retreat brought a peculiar kind of peace to the ranch, the kind that felt both earned and fragile, like morning frost that could melt away with the first harsh word or hostile glance. Reed worked the land with renewed purpose, his hands building not just structures, but a future he could finally see clearly. The new barn rose timber by timber, more solid than its predecessor, positioned strategically, so it could be defended if necessary, but built with hope rather than fear. Awanada's pregnancy began to show more each day, a gentle rounding of her belly that Reed found himself watching with wonder and protectiveness in equal measure. She moved through their home with quiet confidence, now no longer a guest or even just a partner, but the heart of something larger than either of them had imagined possible. She sang while she worked those Apache growing songs mixed with new melodies. She was creating songs about spring coming after long winters and seeds taking root in difficult soil. One morning in late October, Reed woke to find her standing at the window, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in impossible colors. Her hand rested on her stomach, and there was something in her profile, something peaceful and complete, that made his chest ache with emotions he still didn't have adequate words for. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly, not wanting to break the moment, but needing to be part of it. She turned and smiled, that full, genuine smile that had become more frequent as safety and love worked their slow magic. "I am thinking about names," she said, "about what we will call this child who does not yet know how complicated the world will be." Reed rose and crossed to her, wrapping his arms around her from behind his hands, covering hers on the swell of their child. "What kind of names are you thinking to Names that honor both worlds," Awanada said. "Both peoples. So the child knows they come from strength on both sides, that they do not have to choose one heritage over another, but can hold both." She tilted her head back against his shoulder. "If it is a boy, I thought maybe Neshoba. It means wolf in my language. Strong and loyal provider and protector. Neshoba Holston." Reed tested the name, feeling how the syllables fit together. "I like it. It's strong. What about for a girl, Sentie Adsila?" Awanada said immediately. "It means blossom, something beautiful that grows even in harsh places, something that brings color and life to difficult land." She paused. "But these are just thoughts. We decide together, yes? This is our child, our choice. Our everything," Reed agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "But I love both those names. They feel right, like they're already waiting for whoever this little person turns out to be." They stood together watching the sun climb higher, and Reed found himself doing something he hadn't done since Sarah's death. He prayed. Not to any specific god or following any particular doctrine, but just a simple, desperate plea to whatever forces might be listening. "Keep them safe. Let me be good enough for this. Give us time to build something lasting before the world tries to tear it down again." The barn was finished by mid-November, just as the first serious cold began settling over the territory. It wasn't as large as the original structure, but it was solid and well-built, with strong doors that could be barred from inside and a loft that could serve as an observation point if needed. Reed and Awanada stood back admiring their work, both of them marked by sawdust and sweat and the satisfaction of creation. "It is good," Awanada said. "Strong enough to last." "Like us," Reed replied, and she smiled and took his hand. That evening they had unexpected visitors again, but this time it was Tom Whitaker accompanied by an older woman Reed didn't recognize. She was Apache, though dressed in settler clothing with silver threading through her dark hair and eyes that held the particular wisdom of someone who'd survived more than most. "This is Mary Sweetwater," Whitaker said by way of introduction. "She's a healer, lives about 2 days north. I told her about your situation, thought she might be able to help when the baby comes." Mary dismounted with the easy grace of someone much younger and turned her attention immediately to Awanada, speaking in rapid Apache that made Awanada's eyes go wide with surprise and emotion. They talked for several minutes while Reed and Whitaker stood back giving them space. "That was kind of you," Reed said quietly to Whitaker, "bringing her all this way." "Seemed necessary," Whitaker replied with a shrug. "Mary delivered my own children back before, well before. She knows her business, and she knows how to be discreet. Figure your wife could use someone who understands both sides of her heritage when her time comes." Reed felt gratitude surge through him, made even more powerful because it was unexpected. "I don't know how to repay you for everything you've done for us." "Don't need repayment," Whitaker said gruffly. "Just be happy. Build that family. Show the bastards that love wins sometimes, even when the odds are stacked against it." He paused. "And maybe invite me over for dinner now and then. Gets lonely eating alone." "Any time," Reed promised. "Our door's always open to you." Mary stayed for 3 days teaching Awanada what to expect during labor, showing Reed how he could help preparing medicines and tinctures that would ease pain and promote healing. She examined Awanada thoroughly and pronounced both mother and child healthy and strong. "This one has good spirit," Mary said to Reed on her last evening, speaking in accented but clear English. "Your wife, she has survived much. That strength will serve her when birth comes." She fixed him with a serious look. "But you must be prepared too. Birth is dangerous, especially out here with no doctor nearby. You must be ready for anything, ready to make hard choices if necessary." Reed felt ice form in his stomach. "What kind of choices?" "The kind no one wants to make," Mary said gently. "Mother or child if something goes wrong. You must think now before panic clouds thinking about what you would choose." Reed couldn't speak, couldn't imagine having to make such a choice. Mary seemed to understand his silence. "Most times everything goes well," she said. "Baby comes, mother recovers, life continues. But knowing what you would do in worst case, it helps. It gives focus when fear tries to take over." She placed a weathered hand on his arm. "I will come back when her time is near. Send word through Whitaker, and I will come as quickly as I can. Until then, keep her healthy, keep her calm, and trust that the spirits who brought you together will see you through this too." After Mary left, Reed found himself watching Awanada with new intensity, seeing fragility where before he'd only seen strength. The reality of what was coming hit him in waves, the actual physical danger of childbirth, the 1,000 things that could go wrong, the possibility that he might lose her just as he'd found her. Awanada caught him staring one evening and called him on it. "You are afraid," she said. It wasn't a question. "Terrified," Reed admitted. Mary's talk about choices, about dangers, it made everything real in a way it hasn't been before. Awanada set down the shirt she was mending and crossed to him, taking his face in her hands. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "I am strong. This body has survived starvation, cold violence, and loss. It will survive bringing life into the world. You must believe this, must hold this truth, because I need your strength, not your fear." "What if something goes wrong?" Reed asked hoarsely. "What if I have to choose?" "Then you choose the child," Awanada interrupted. "Without hesitation, without guilt, you choose our baby." Her eyes were fierce. "I have lived my life, have experienced love and loss and everything between. This child has not. If it comes to choice, you save them and you raise them to know they were loved before they were born." "I can't." "You can," Awanada said. "Because you are strong enough, because you promised to protect us, and sometimes protecting means making impossible choices." She softened slightly. "But it will not come to that. I feel it. This baby wants to live, wants to meet us, wants to be part of this world we are building. Everything will be fine." Reed pulled her close, breathing in the scent of sage and smoke that always clung to her hair, and tried to make himself believe her words. But fear had lodged itself in his heart, like a splinter working deeper with each passing day, as her body changed and time marched steadily toward the moment when theory would become reality. December brought snow to the high country and bitter cold to the ranch. Reed worked to winterize everything, sealing gaps, stockpiling firewood, ensuring the animals had adequate shelter. Awanada moved slower now, her belly prominent and her back aching from the weight she carried. But she refused to be treated as fragile, insisted on helping with daily chores, on maintaining her autonomy even as her body transformed. They developed new rhythms for these winter months. Mornings, Reed would wake first, start fires throughout the cabin to chase away the cold, bring Awanada breakfast in bed because her back hurt too much to rise easily. Afternoons, they'd work together on tasks that could be done inside, mending tack, repairing clothes, preparing the small room off the main cabin that would become the nursery. Evenings, they'd sit by the fire while Awanada sewed tiny garments and Reed carved small toys from scraps of wood, both of them talking about the future in quiet, hopeful voices. One particularly cold evening in late December, Awanada suddenly laughed and grabbed Reed's hand, pressing it against her belly. "Feel," she commanded. Reed felt a strong kick against his palm, then another, and his eyes went wide with wonder. "That's our child," Awanada said, her face radiant, saying hello, letting us know they're strong and ready. Reed kept his hand there, feeling movement that was somehow both alien and miraculous. This was real. This was happening. In a few more months, there would be a person here, a tiny human who was part him and part Awanada and entirely themselves. The weight of responsibility was staggering, but beneath the fear was something else. Excitement, anticipation, the sense of standing on the edge of something profound. "Hello," Reed said softly to Awanada's belly. "We're your parents, and we're probably going to mess up a lot, but we already love you more than seems possible. And we promise to do our best to protect you and teach you and help you grow into whoever you're meant to be." Awanada's eyes were bright with tears. "You will be good father," she said. "The kind who is present, who listens, who sees child as person, not possession." She paused. "Not like the fathers of my people or the fathers of yours. Better. New kind of father for new kind of world." Reed hoped she was right. Hoped he could live up to the faith she placed in him, the expectations he was placing on himself. All he could do was try and keep trying and trust that love would fill in the gaps where knowledge and experience fell short. The new year arrived quietly, without celebration or ceremony, just another day of survival and small victories. Reed marked it in his journal with a simple notation: 1876, Awanada healthy, baby coming soon, ranch secure, life continuing. But the peace couldn't last forever, and trouble returned in early January in a form Reed hadn't anticipated. He was in the barn tending to the horses when he heard a rider approaching. Reed grabbed his rifle and stepped out to find not Braddock or his men, but a younger man wearing a federal marshal's badge, different from the territorial marshal Reed had spoken to before. This one looked official, serious, and carried documentation that made Reed's stomach drop. "Reed Holston?" the marshal asked, dismounting. "That's me. I'm Federal Marshal James Crawford. I'm here about the woman you're keeping on this property." He pulled out papers from his saddlebag. "I have a warrant for the arrest of an Apache woman matching her description wanted in connection with raids conducted in Arizona and New Mexico territories. I need you to produce her for questioning." Reed felt his world tilting. This wasn't Braddock's harassment. This was federal authority, real legal weight behind it. "She's innocent," he said. "She wasn't involved in any raids. She's been here with me for months." "That's for a judge to decide," Crawford said, not unkindly, but firmly. "I don't make determinations of guilt or innocence. I just execute warrants." He looked past Reed toward the cabin. "Is she here?" Reed's mind raced, calculating options and outcomes. He could refuse, could try to fight, but federal authority was different from local corruption. Crawford wasn't. Braddock wasn't acting from personal vendetta, but from duty. Fighting him would make things worse, would paint Reed and Awanada as fugitives rather than innocent people caught in a bad situation. "She's pregnant," Reed said desperately. "Due in about 2 months. Traveling now, being held in custody could kill her or the baby, or both." Crawford's expression softened slightly. "I understand that's difficult, but the law doesn't make exceptions for pregnancy. She'll be held in Tucson, which has a doctor. She'll be treated humanely and given a fair trial." "She won't get a fair trial, and you know it," Reed said harshly. "She's Apache. There's a war on. Every crime committed by any Apache gets blamed on every other Apache, and justice has nothing to do with it." "Maybe," Crawford acknowledged. "But that's not for me to decide. My job is to bring her in." He paused. "I can do this easy or hard, Mr. Holston. I'd prefer easy for everyone's sake. But either way, I'm leaving here with her." Reed heard the cabin door open and turned to see Awanada standing in the doorway, her hand on her swollen belly, her face pale but composed. She'd heard everything. "I will go," she said quietly. "I will not force Reed to choose between me and the law. I will not make him into outlaw for loving me." "No," Reed said immediately. "We'll fight this. We'll get lawyers, we'll prove your innocence." "With what money?" Awanada interrupted gently. "With what connections, Reed, we both know how this ends. Better to face it now with dignity than to run and make everything worse." She moved toward him, her movements slow and careful. "You can visit me. You can bring food, bring warmth. And when the trial happens, you can speak for me. Tell them who I am, what I have done and not done." "I can't lose you," Reed said, his voice breaking. "Not now, not when we're so close to having everything we fought for." Awanada touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that worry and weather had carved there. "You will not lose me," she said. "I am strong. I will survive this like I have survived everything else. And when I return, and I will return, we will continue building our life together." Reed wanted to argue, wanted to fight, wanted to do anything except watch her be taken away. But he saw the determination in her eyes and understood that this was her choice, her decision about how to face what was coming. Denying her that agency would be its own kind of violation. "Give us a moment," Reed said roughly to Crawford. "Let me pack her some things." The marshal nodded and stepped back, giving them space. Reed led Awanada into the cabin and immediately started gathering supplies. Warm clothes, food, the medicines Mary had left, blankets, everything he could think of that might make imprisonment more bearable. "Take this," he said, pressing money into her hands. "It's not much, but it might buy you small comforts. Better food, warmer quarters, something." "Reed." "And this," he continued, fastening Sarah's ring more securely on her finger. "So you remember you're my wife. So you remember you belong somewhere to someone. So you remember to come back." Awanada pulled him into a fierce embrace, her belly pressing between them, their child a physical reminder of everything at stake. "I love you," she whispered. "Whatever happens, whatever comes, I love you, and I am grateful for every moment we have had." "This isn't goodbye," Reed said fiercely. "This is temporary. I'll come to Tucson. I'll find a lawyer. I'll move heaven and earth to get you back." "I know," Awanada said. "But just in case something goes wrong, promise me you will take care of our child. Promise me you will raise them with love, will teach them about both their heritages, will help them become strong and good." "You'll be there to do it with me," Reed insisted. "Promise me anyway." Reed looked into her eyes. Those dark, deep eyes that had first caught him in an auction yard, that had watched him with suspicion, and then with trust, and finally with love, and made the promise. "I swear, on my life, on everything I am, I swear I'll protect our child and raise them to know how extraordinary their mother was." They held each other until Crawford cleared his throat apologetically, and then Reed had to watch as Awanada gathered her things, wrapped herself in the warmest coat they owned, and walked out into the winter cold toward an uncertain future. Crawford helped her mount his spare horse with surprising gentleness. "She'll be treated well," he said to Reed. "I'll make sure of that, and the trial will be fair. I'll see to it personally." Reed wanted to believe him, but couldn't quite manage it. He stood in the doorway watching them ride away, watching Awanada's straight back and proud posture, watching until they disappeared over the ridge, and he was alone again. The cabin felt immediately wrong without her, too quiet, too empty, too much like the mausoleum it had been before she'd brought it back to life. Reed stood in the center of the main room and felt 10 years of careful emotional reconstruction threatening to collapse. He'd opened himself up again, had allowed himself to hope and love and plan for a future, and now it was being ripped away, just like before. But this wasn't like Sarah's death, he reminded himself. Awanada was alive. The situation was terrible, but not hopeless. There were things he could do, actions he could take, ways he could fight for her that he hadn't been able to fight against disease. Reed spent that night sitting at the table writing letters to lawyers he'd heard of but never met, to the territorial governor, to anyone he could think of who might have influence or interest in justice. He wrote about Awanada's character, about her innocence, about the child she carried, and the life they were trying to build. He wrote until his hand cramped and dawn broke over the empty ranch. and then he rode to Whitaker's property to ask for help. Whitaker listened to the whole story with a grim expression, then nodded. "We'll organize something. Talk to the other ranchers, see if we can get statements about her character, about the fact she's been here with you and couldn't have been involved in any raids. Get some money together for a lawyer, a real one, not some local hack." He paused. "But Reed, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that it won't be enough. The odds are stacked pretty heavily against Apache defendants right now." "I know," Reed said, "but I have to try. I have to do everything I can, use every resource fight with everything I have. Because the alternative, accepting that she's just gone, that our child will be born in a cell, that everything we built was for nothing, that's not acceptable. That's not something I can live with." "Then we fight," Whitaker said simply. "All of us. Together." The next 2 weeks were a blur of activity. Reed rode to Tucson twice to visit Awanada in the jail, where she was being held. The conditions weren't as bad as he'd feared. She had a cell to herself, blankets to stay warm, food that was adequate if not good. But seeing her behind bars, seeing the way pregnancy was advancing without him there to help, broke something in Reed that he wasn't sure would ever fully heal. "How are you?" he asked through the bars, holding her hand as tightly as he could. "Surviving," Awanada said with a wan smile. "Baby is strong. Kicks constantly, like they are training for war already." She paused. "There is a doctor who comes sometimes. He says everything is progressing normally, that birth should be uncomplicated. But Reed, if I am still here when my time comes, if I give birth in this cell," her voice cracked, "I do not want our child's first moments to be in cage." "It won't come to that," Reed promised, praying he was right. "Your trial is scheduled for next month. We've got a lawyer, a good one, someone who's actually interested in justice. And we've got character witnesses lining up, people willing to testify about your time on the ranch, about your innocence." He squeezed her hand. "We're going to win this." But doubt gnawed at him even as he spoke. The evidence against Awanada was circumstantial. At best, she fit the description of an Apache woman seen near one of the raid sites had been found in the general area months later. But in the current climate where fear and prejudice ran high, and Apache lives were valued less than livestock, circumstantial evidence might be enough. The lawyer Reed had hired, a man named Benjamin Foster, who'd actually defended Apache clients before, was cautiously optimistic. "The prosecution's case is weak," he explained during their first meeting. "Eyewitness accounts are unreliable. The timeline doesn't quite work, and we can prove she was with you during several of the alleged incidents." But he hesitated. "A lot will depend on the judge we get and the composition of the jury. If they're predisposed to see all Apache as guilty, evidence won't matter much." "So what do we do?" Reed asked. "We prepare the best case we can, we present the truth clearly and powerfully, and we hope that justice prevails." Foster looked at Reed seriously. "And you need to prepare yourself for the possibility of an unjust verdict. If that happens, there are appeals we can file, but they take time. Time your wife may not have given her condition." Reed left that meeting feeling hollowed out, scraped raw by fears he couldn't quite articulate. He threw himself into ranch work with desperate intensity, rebuilding fences that didn't need rebuilding, reorganizing the barn for the third time, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from spiraling into darkness. One evening in late January, Reed returned from another trip to Tucson to find Tom Whitaker waiting at the ranch with news. "The trial's been moved up," Whitaker said. "Judge wants it handled before your wife goes into labor. It starts next week." Reed felt simultaneous relief and terror. Sooner meant less time in jail for Awanada, but also less time to prepare, less time to gather support. "Next week," he repeated numbly. "That's—" "I know," Whitaker said. "But there's more. The federal government is sending an observer, someone from Washington who's been investigating treatment of Apaches in custody. He's concerned about potential violations of treaty obligations, wants to ensure this trial is handled properly." He paused. "It's not a guarantee, but having federal oversight might help. Might keep things more honest than they would be otherwise." "Or might make no difference at all," Reed said bitterly. "Maybe," Whitaker acknowledged. "But right now we take what advantages we can get. The trial began on a Monday in early February in a packed courtroom that reeked of unwashed bodies and hostile anticipation. Reed sat in the front row directly behind where Foster had positioned Awanada, his eyes never leaving her as the proceedings began. She looked tired, her pregnancy now unavoidably obvious, but she held herself with dignity that seemed to embarrass some of the spectators who'd come expecting a savage. The prosecution's case was exactly what Foster had predicted: circumstantial evidence, questionable eyewitness testimony. Lots of inflammatory language about Apache violence and the need for justice. They paraded witnesses who claimed to have seen an Apache woman matching Awanada's description near raid sites, conveniently forgetting to mention that such descriptions could fit hundreds of women. Then it was Foster's turn, and Reed watched with anxious hope as his lawyer methodically dismantled the prosecution's case. He established timeline inconsistencies, pointed out the impossibility of Awanada being in multiple places at once, questioned the reliability of witnesses who admitted they'd been drunk or hadn't gotten a clear look. He brought in Whitaker and the other ranchers to testify about Awanada's character, about the peaceful life she'd been living on Reed's property. Finally, Foster called Reed himself to the stand. "Mr. Holston," Foster began, "please tell the court how you came to know the defendant." Reed took a deep breath and told the truth, all of it. He described the auction, his decision to buy her freedom, the months they'd spent building a life together. He talked about her work ethic, her kindness, her absolute innocence of any crimes. He talked about falling in love with her, about the child they were expecting, about the future they were trying to create in a world that seemed determined to destroy it. "She's my wife," Reed said, looking directly at the jury. "Maybe not legally, maybe not in a way the law recognizes, but in every way that matters. She's the person I chose to build a life with, the mother of my child, the woman who reminded me what it means to be human after I'd spent 10 years forgetting." He paused, emotion thick in his throat. "She's innocent. And if you convict her, you're not delivering justice, you're just perpetuating the cycle of violence and hatred that's already cost too many lives on both sides." The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal, trying to paint Reed as delusional or corrupted, suggesting Awanada had manipulated him, insinuating that his testimony was worthless because he was too emotionally compromised to see clearly. But Reed held his ground, answering every question with steady honesty that seemed to resonate with at least some members of the jury. The federal observer, a serious man named Thompson, who took copious notes throughout, questioned both sides extensively, particularly pressing the prosecution on the quality of their evidence. His presence seemed to make everyone more careful, more measured in their claims. The trial lasted 3 days. 3 days of testimony and argument and legal maneuvering, while Awanada sat silent and dignified, her hands occasionally moving to her belly in that protective gesture Reed had come to know so well. 3 days of Reed barely sleeping, barely eating, existing in a state of suspended terror as he waited for the jury to decide their future. On the 4th day, the jury returned with their verdict. Reed held his breath as the foreman stood, held Awanada's hand across the barrier that separated them, held on to hope with every fiber of his being. "We find the defendant not guilty." The words took a moment to penetrate, and then Reed was on his feet, emotion crashing through him like a physical force. Not guilty. She was free. They were free. The nightmare was over. Awanada turned and their eyes met, and Reed saw tears streaming down her face, tears of relief and joy and disbelief that justice had actually impossibly prevailed. The judge banged his gavel, officially releasing her from custody, and then she was in Reed's arms, both of them holding each other and crying, while the courtroom erupted in mixed reactions around them. "It's over," Reed whispered into her hair. "You're free. We're going home." "Home," Awanada repeated like the word was sacred. "Yes, home." They collected her belongings and walked out of that courthouse into cold February sunlight that had never looked more beautiful. Whitaker and the other ranchers who'd testified were waiting outside, and they offered congratulations and handshakes and promises to help with anything needed. The ride back to the ranch took 2 days. They had to move slowly, given Awanada's condition and exhaustion, but Reed didn't mind. Every mile that separated them from Tucson felt like reclaiming stolen ground every moment together, felt like a gift he'd never take for granted again. When they finally crested the ridge and the ranch came into view, Awanada made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. I was so afraid I would never see this place again, she said. Never smell sage on the wind, never hear the horses, never sleep in our bed. You're home now, Reed said, and you're never leaving again. I don't care what laws they pass or what wars break out. Nothing is taking you from this place, from me, from the life we've built. They fell back into their rhythms easily, as if the nightmare of the trial had been a brief interruption rather than a fundamental threat. Awanada resumed her work around the ranch, though Reed insisted she take things easier, given how close she was to her due date. They finished preparing the nursery, stocked it with the small garments and toys they'd made, placed the cradle Reed had carved near the window where morning sun would warm it. In early March, Awanada woke Reed in the middle of the night with a calm that seemed almost surreal. It is time, she said simply. Baby is coming. Reed bolted upright, panic and excitement warring in his chest. Now, are you sure? Should I... Breathe? Awanada interrupted, her hand on his chest. And send someone for Mary, but do not panic. We have time. Reed rode through darkness to Whitaker's ranch, woke the older man with urgent knocking, and asked him to ride for Mary while Reed returned to Awanada. By the time he got back, contractions were coming regularly, and Awanada was walking circuits around the cabin, breathing through each wave of pain with the same controlled strength she brought to everything. What do you need? Reed asked, desperate to be useful. Water boiling, clean cloths, your presence. Awanada smiled through obvious pain. And maybe for you to stop looking like you are about to die. I am the one doing hard work here. Reed forced himself to focus, to move through the preparations Mary had taught them. He boiled water, gathered supplies, lit every lamp in the cabin so no shadow could hide. And he stayed close to Awanada, letting her grip his hand during contractions, supporting her weight when she needed to lean on something solid. Mary arrived just after dawn, her experienced presence immediately calming Reed's panic. She examined Awanada, nodded approvingly, and settled in to guide them through what was coming. Labor was longer than Reed had expected, though Mary assured him it was normal for a first child. All through the day and into the evening, Awanada worked with single-minded determination, her body performing the ancient task of bringing forth life. Reed stayed beside her the entire time, offering water and support and words of encouragement that felt inadequate against the magnitude of what she was enduring. "You're so strong," he kept saying, amazed and humbled by her endurance. "So incredibly strong. Tell me that, when this is over." Awanada gasped between contractions, and even in extremity she could smile. As night fell again, Mary declared it was time to push. Reed supported Awanada's back while she bore down with primal force, and for a terrifying hour Reed watched her work harder than he'd ever seen anyone work for anything. Watched her face contort with effort and pain. Watched her body perform miracles. And then as stars wheeled overhead and a new moon rose in darkness, their child entered the world with a cry that seemed to fill the entire universe. "A girl!" Mary announced, wrapping the baby in clean cloth. Small but strong, perfect. Reed looked at his daughter, and felt his entire understanding of existence reorganize itself around her tiny presence. She was red-faced and squalling, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would be dark like her mother's. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Mary placed the baby on Awanada's chest, and Reed watched his wife, exhausted, triumphant, glowing with accomplishment, cradle their child for the first time. The baby immediately calmed, recognizing her mother's heartbeat, her warmth, her scent. "Hello, Adsila," Awanada whispered, using the name they'd chosen. "Hello, little blossom. Welcome to the world. Welcome to your family." Reed knelt beside them, one hand gently touching his daughter's impossibly small head, the other wrapped around Awanada. "She's perfect." He managed his voice thick with tears he didn't bother hiding. "You're both perfect." They stayed like that for a long time, the three of them together, while Mary cleaned up and checked to ensure Awanada and the baby were both healthy. Outside, dawn was breaking over Redstone Ridge, painting the world in colors of gold and promise. Spring was coming, bringing with it warmth and growth and possibility. Reed looked at his wife and daughter, at the life they'd somehow managed to build against impossible odds, and felt something settle in his chest that had been restless since Sarah's death. This was what healing looked like, not forgetting the past or pretending loss hadn't happened, but making space for new love, new life, new chapters that honored what came before while embracing what could be. "I love you," he said to both of them. "More than I have words for, more than I thought I was capable of." "We love you too," Awanada said, her eyes bright with joy and exhaustion. "Our family loves you." Our family. The words resonated through Reed like a bell announcing something fundamental and true. He'd been alone for so long, had built walls so high around his heart that he'd thought nothing could breach them. But Awanada had done exactly that, not through force, but through persistence, through choosing him again and again, through showing him that opening yourself to pain was the only way to also open yourself to joy. Mary left the next morning after ensuring mother and child were both thriving. Word spread quickly about the birth, and over the following days they had visitors bringing gifts, blankets, and food, and small carved toys offerings from neighbors who'd stood with them through the darkest times. Tom Whitaker came with his wife's old cradle, beautifully preserved. Pete Harrison brought a rocking chair his father had made. Even people Reed barely knew stopped by with gifts and congratulations, as if the baby had become a symbol of something larger than one family's happiness. "She's bringing the community together," Awanada observed one evening, watching Adsila sleep in her cradle, "making people remember what matters more than fear or prejudice." "She's extraordinary," Reed agreed, "just like her mother." The weeks that followed were exhausting and beautiful in equal measure. Reed learned the particular terror of being responsible for something so small and fragile, the way his daughter's cries could send him into panic, and her smiles could make him forget every hardship he'd ever endured. He learned to change diapers to warm milk, when Awanada was too tired to walk the floors at 3 in the morning, singing off-key lullabies that somehow soothed. And he watched Awanada transform into motherhood with the same strength she brought to everything else. She sang to Adsila in Apache, teaching their daughter the language and songs of her people. She told stories about her own childhood, about traditions and values she wanted to pass on. She was building bridges between two worlds in the person of their child, creating something new from elements of both. Spring arrived in full force, turning the harsh landscape green and alive. Reed worked the land with renewed purpose, expanding the garden planning improvements, thinking in terms of years and decades rather than just surviving to the next season. Awanada worked beside him when she could. Adsila often strapped to her back in the traditional way, the baby's dark eyes taking in the world she'd been born into. One evening in late April, they sat on the porch, as had become their custom, watching the sun set fire to the western sky. Adsila was nursing contentedly, and the sounds of ranch-life chickens, settling horses, nickering wind moving through new leaves created a symphony of peace. "Are you happy?" Reed asked suddenly, needing to hear her say it. Awanada looked at him, one hand supporting their daughter, the other reaching for his. "Yes," she said simply. "I am happy. Not because life is easy or because we have forgotten the hard things, but because we have built something real from the ruins of what was lost." She paused. "You saved me, Reed. Not just from that auction yard, but from a life without purpose, without love, without hope. You gave me reasons to keep living when I had forgotten why living mattered." "You saved me too," Reed said, "from ghosts and grief and the slow death of isolation. You reminded me that the heart can heal if you're brave enough to let it, that love doesn't run out just because you've already loved and lost." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars emerged, their daughter between them, the ranch spreading around them, the future unfolding with all its uncertainty and promise. They'd both lost so much: families, cultures, first loves, innocence, but they'd found each other and built something that honored their pasts while creating space for new possibilities. "What do you think she'll become?" Awanada wondered, looking down at Adsila's small, sleeping face. "This child of two worlds, two peoples." "I think she'll be whatever she chooses," Reed said, "strong like her mother, stubborn like her father, and entirely herself. And we'll be here to support her, to guide her, to love her, no matter what path she takes." "Yes," Awanada agreed softly, "we will." As the night deepened around them, Reed reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the horror of that auction yard to the peace of this porch. From isolation to connection, from survival to actually living. It hadn't been easy, probably never would be easy, given the world they inhabited and the prejudices still arrayed against them. But they'd proven that love could survive in hostile territory, that family could be built from unlikely pieces, that choosing hope over fear was an act of courage that paid dividends neither could have imagined. Reed looked at his wife and daughter, at the home they'd created, at the life they were living, despite every odd stacked against them, and felt gratitude so profound it was almost painful. This was grace he understood, not the absence of suffering, but the presence of love strong enough to make suffering bearable. Not forgetting the past, but learning to carry it forward in ways that added weight without crushing spirit. "Thank you," he said to Awanada, though the words felt inadequate for everything he meant. She understood anyway. "Thank you," she echoed, "for seeing me, for choosing me, for building this with me." They sat together as the stars wheeled overhead and their daughter slept between them. Two people who'd been broken, learning that broken things could still be beautiful, still be functional, still be worthy of love and joy and hope. They'd survived the worst and found each other in the aftermath, and now they were living, really living, not just existing, and that was its own kind of miracle. The ranch stretched around them in darkness, but it wasn't the threatening darkness of isolation anymore. It was the comfortable darkness of home, of safety, of a place where they belonged. Not because someone granted them permission, but because they'd claimed it through work and love and sheer stubborn determination. And in that darkness, under those stars, with spring alive around them, and their daughter breathing softly between them, Reed and Awanada were finally, impossibly, completely home.